Present us, O Lord, in all our doings with thy most gracious favour, and further us with thy continual help, that in all our works begun, continued, and ended in thee, we may glorify thy holy name, and finally by thy mercy attain everlasting life. Amen. Introduction of guests. I recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I would ask for leave for three groups of guests that have joined us here to introduce them, please.
Premier's asked leave for three groups for an extended introduction. Is leave granted? Recognize the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the members of the House. I have three groups of people that have joined us in their legislative assembly here today, and I appreciate the opportunities. They are a little lengthy, but very important, Mr. Speaker. First, among them, we have some visitors here today, Mr. Speaker, from the Makwassahagan community, Mr. Speaker, north of Meadow Lake. We have with us Chief Ronald Mitzwing as well as Barry Shalafar that have joined today, met with a number of members on both sides of the House, Mr. Speaker. Excuse me, Mr. Speaker, and we want to, first of all, express our deep gratitude, condolences to all of those in the community as we know the occurrences there over the course of the last number of days. We want to thank them for coming to the legislature and engaging here today so that we can most certainly align our resources, Mr. Speaker, so that they are effective on behalf of the members that we mutually serve. Mr. Speaker, also joining us here today are some very special guests with us from our Saskatchewan Roughriders organization. Mr. Speaker, we have Craig Reynolds, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Saskatchewan Roughriders. We have Mr. Jeremy O'Day, the Vice President of Football Operations and the General Manager, and Craig Dickinson, the head coach of the head coach and the special teams coordinators for our football team. Mr. Speaker, I had the honor, as many on this side had the honor of having lunch with these gentlemen, and we had the opportunity to look back over what was an incredible season that just ended here not too long ago, a successful season by any measure, Mr. Speaker, and we discussed what lies ahead in next year's season as our riders prepare for 2020, leading up to what will ultimately be the Grey Cup game right here in Saskatchewan's capital city. And I think many of us in Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker, if we look back to Game 1 of this year, we were quite pleased with the season that we had as we talked once you got over licking our wounds of not winning the last game of the season, Mr. Speaker. But it most certainly was a great season, and it was started with an individual that we didn't know a whole big bunch about, Mr. Speaker, and that was one Cody Fajardo. But we know a lot more about this individual now, and he is a tremendous quarterback in his own right, and I think it's fair to say, Mr. Speaker, he's an even better person than he is an athlete. But the fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, is that Cody was in a position to succeed this year because the Riders organization was in a position to succeed this year, Mr. Speaker, a team with outstanding coaching staff and very, very solid management. Mr. Speaker, this year was Craig Dickinson's first year as head coach in our Canadian Football League, and judging from the results, I think he's getting the hang of it. Riders won 13 games this year. First time that has occurred since 1970. Mr. Speaker, they finished first in the Western Conference for only the second time in the last 40 years. Craig was recognized as the Western Conference Coach of the Year, and most deservedly, he received that award. Mr. Speaker, NFL coaching legend Tom Landry, he said that leadership in football is a matter of having the players look at you and having them gain confidence. Well, Coach Landry said, if you're in control, they're in control. Well, Mr. Speaker, Craig Dickinson is clearly in control as head coach of our beloved Saskatchewan Roughriders, and his team is in good hands. This team is in great hands with Craig at the helm. And Mr. Speaker, I would say that the Riders are in good hands with Craig Reynolds and the likes of Jeremy O'Day leading in the front office. We can sometimes forget that the Riders are a big business in this province, and at times a complicated business. There are many thousands, hundreds of thousands of shareholders, Mr. Speaker, or at least those that feel that they're shareholders in this team. And we get second-guessed from time to time on the floor of this Assembly, but we get second-guessed not anywhere near to the degree that these three gentlemen do across this province, Mr. Speaker. And Craig and Jeremy, they have made a lot of good moves in their time in the front office, Mr. Speaker, and including hiring a pretty darn good head coach. Mr. Speaker, second among those might be signing Cody Fajardo to another contract and stick-handling the explosive controversy over their mascot earlier on this year, Mr. Speaker. That could have gone sideways. In fact, it did go sideways for a short period of time, but it didn't for very long because of the strength of this organization. So, Mr. Speaker, next season is going to be an exciting one for the Riders in our province, and we're going to be hosting the Grey Cup here in our very new stadium. Mr. Speaker, the party will be bigger, it will be better than it has ever been at an expanded Evraz Place. And the Riders, Mr. Speaker, I would say the Riders, our beloved football team right here in Saskatchewan, they stand a good chance of being in that game. This is a team that is built for sustained success, a strong contender, and in large part because of the leadership of these three individuals right here. Mr. Speaker, we are grateful. These gentlemen are on the job, and I would ask all members in this Assembly to welcome these guests to their legislature. And Mr. Speaker, I beg forgiveness for the length of time, but these are important introductions, Mr. Speaker. Last, but certainly not least, it's my great pleasure to you and through you and to this Assembly to introduce two very special guests that are here. We have with us, Mr. Speaker, Carrie Bodie, the Sales Administration Manager with South Country Equipment and also an owner of the company, Mr. Speaker. Carrie is accompanied by someone that is no stranger to this legislature, Mr. Speaker, who is a good friend to members I know on both sides of this House, and that's Mr. John Hopkins, the CEO of the Regina District Chamber of Commerce. Well, Mr. Speaker, South Country Equipment is one of Saskatchewan's largest farm equipment dealerships with 8 locations and more than 200 employees employed in our communities in this province, Mr. Speaker. And the company was founded more than 50 years ago, and it provides a full range of dealership services in communities across the southern areas of our province. Mr. Speaker, Carrie has played an integral role in the company's success while raising her 2 children, and Carrie is a high-energy person in her own right. She is a determined person, Mr. Speaker, and we know this because of what she does when she's not at work. Carrie is a competitive runner who has volunteered extensively, helping to organize events like the Queen City Marathon. In fact, Mr. Speaker, you would have an appreciation for this, participating in marathons yourself. Carrie has finished 33 marathons during her career, including 4 Boston marathons. What an incredible record. Mr. Speaker, South Country Equipment has been a fixture in our business community for decades now, and Carrie is an outstanding ambassador for the company. We are thankful for everything that she and her colleagues do, supporting our grain producers in their vital mission of feeding the world, and we're also grateful, Mr. Speaker, for the work that John Hopkins does on behalf of this city and this province each and every day that he goes to work. Mr. Speaker, John was recently recognized as Regina's Humanitarian of the Year, and I cannot think of anyone more deserving for that award. He has given back to this community in so many ways, including most recently as a member of a sizzling group known as the Garage Band, Mr. Speaker, along with John was joined by the mayor of this city, Mayor Fragere, as well as Murad Al-Khatib, David Malloy, and other luminaries that compose this group, Mr. Speaker, and we're able to raise over $1 million to help pay for the 4DCT simulator at the Alan Blair Cancer Centre in Regina, and we thank you, John, for that effort. Mr. Speaker, this is but one demonstration of John's efforts here in Regina, his efforts and his extraordinary generosity and compassion. He is a great example for all of us, Mr. Speaker, across this province, and I would ask all members of this Legislative Assembly to please welcome each of these guests to their Legislative Assembly.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too request leave for a series of introductions. Thank you.
Leader of the Opposition has asked leave for expanded introductions. Leave granted. Recognize the Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to join the Premier in welcoming many of these same folks to the building, to their assembly, to our discourse today. I want to thank the leadership from the Rough Riders, Mr. Reynolds, Mr. Dickinson, Mr. O'Day, for joining us today. Thank you for the work you do, the joy and passion that your club brings to our province. You know, occasional heartbreak, but far more often a heck of a lot of fun. We're all big fans of the operation here in this building, so thank you for joining us. I also would like to extend my thanks and welcome to Kerry Bowden, South Country Equipment. Thank you for being here today, and Mr. Hopkins. Great to see him here as well, and great to see him in fine form. I also got to see him in fine form this summer, playing with the garage band, rocking out in the backyards. Pretty good show. I also would like to had a chance to quickly say hello. I know a couple of my colleagues spent a little bit more time with them today, but Mr. Rob Norris and the rest of the team from the Canadian Light Source, great to see. Of course, Mr. Norris, no stranger to this place, and the rest of the team. I had a chance to tour recently the Canadian Light Source, incredible facility that brings hundreds of top talented researchers, thinkers in our country, in our world, together to tackle some of the big scientific questions. And I really respect, admire, and am grateful for the work that's done, and believe that's a great contribution for the future of our province. I also want to spend a little bit of time recognizing and welcoming Chief Ronald Mitzwing, Barry Chalafu. They're also joined by Myra, who works in suicide prevention, folks from Makwasagagan First Nation. And they're in your gallery, Mr. Speaker, and they're here for reasons we're not happy to celebrate. We are here to share our condolences with them for the losses and near losses in their community in recent days. It has been terrible to watch, but I also must say that I've watched with admiration as the chief and the rest of the team have responded with such leadership. They've raised the call for a state of emergency. They've recognized that this is not something to be taken lightly, and they're here today away from the community in a time of crisis, knowing that they had to leave folks at home to deal with the actions today, to come and speak up and present the need for more support and more resources for their community. So I'd like to thank all the members, to welcome all our guests, but in particular the folks from Makwasagagan, give a warm welcome to their Legislative Assembly. Thank you very much.
Recognize the Minister of Parks, Culture and Sport.
Request leave for extended introduction.
Minister has asked leave for an extended introduction. Is leave granted? Recognize the Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In the Speaker's Gallery this afternoon, I'd like to introduce to you a very well-known person in the sporting community in Saskatchewan, Mr. Lauren Lasuda. Lauren officially retired as a provincial games consultant with the Saskatchewan Games Council back at the end of March, but he continued his role during the Western Canada Summer Games recently held in Swift Current. During his career, Lauren has participated in 50 multi-sport games from the Saskatchewan Games all the way to the Olympics. His true passion has been, of course, the Saskatchewan Games program. He's been part of it all but one games in Saskatchewan since 1972. He's been a chef de mission and mission staff member for Canada Games and the Western Canada Summer Games multiple times, and served as administrative officer on Team Canada for the 04 Athens Olympics. During his long career, Lauren has worked with thousands of athletes to advance their goals. He's also made multi-sport games a family affair, with many of his family members participating in 9 Saskatchewan games. This includes his granddaughter who made history, as the first grandfather-granddaughter pair to represent the same contingent at the Canada Games. As mentioned, Lauren is a well-known person at different games events across Canada. Always proud to wear the green of Team Saskatchewan. He will certainly be missed. He's joined by several family members up in the gallery today. So I ask Mr. Speaker that all members please join me in congratulating Lauren for his instrumental work and impact on multi-sport games, sport and recreation at the provincial, national, and international levels, and we wish him all the best on his retirement. Thank you.
Recognize the member for John Elphinstone Centre.
Well, Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the official opposition, I'd like to join the Minister in thanking and congratulating Lauren Lasuda on a tremendous contribution to the province of Saskatchewan. And again, with on into the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren, that contribution will carry forward for many years to come. but it's people like Lauren Osuda that make this such a great province. So thank you very much for a lifetime of work on behalf of all of us.
Recognize the Minister of Central Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to rise and introduce in the West Gallery today Ashlyn Weniger, who is a constituent of Saskatoon Willow Grove. Ashlyn has a son, Austin, who is in grade 7 at the beautiful new Willow Grove School, and Ashlyn is a Director of Marketing and Operations and in Regina today working a booth at Agribition for the Wheatland Express excursion train. But she managed to sneak away for a few minutes to join us for the proceedings today. Mr. Speaker, if you haven't had a chance yet, I strongly encourage you and all colleagues to make the drive to Waka, Saskatchewan and enjoy the many train excursions the Wheatland Express offers. I ask all members to help me welcome Ashlyn to her Legislative Assembly.
Recognize the member for Athabasca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I too want to join my leader in welcoming the chief of the Makwa-Sagahegan Indian band to the Assembly. And Mr. Speaker, it's very important that as legislators that we remind people of Saskatchewan that it is a great honor to have a chief amongst us. And we must place much more respect and honor on that title because, Mr. Speaker, the First Nations in our history have done much to contribute to the growing of Saskatchewan and the establishment of this great country. And I want to say in Cree, Mr. Speaker, Chief, mtinenistan miuhtin kapitaksiniganos, kakasus kwasiguegosta, kek nigana pen soka pengia, so mtinekawegostamatan miuhtin kapitaksinin anos. And I said, I'm very proud of his strength, very proud of his honor of gracing us here with his presence, and to tell him that he has great authority to speak on behalf of his people of the Makwa-Sagahegan, and I wish him the very best in his journey to Regina and wish him success in helping to address the incredible challenges his band members are facing. Thank you again, Chief.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I request leave for an extended introduction.
Member has requested leave for an extended introduction. Is leave granted? Recognize the member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you, I'd like to introduce a group from the Canadian Light Source, one of Canada's leading and largest research facilities and the brightest light in Canada. Our synchrotron produces light millions of times brighter than the sun, which helps to unlock the secrets of the universe, fight cancer, and fuel Saskatchewan's economy. This group is visiting the legislature today to highlight key areas of their research. I'll ask them to stand and give a wave. CEO Dr. Robert Lamb, an international synchrotron expert, shared how CLS research is directly and positively impacting the lives of Canadians and helping to drive our economy. Dr. Shitra Karunakaran, a world-leading plant imaging scientist, noted that the CLS is in the world-leading position to develop technologies for improved crop development. Dr. Lucia Zwin, using her state-of-the-art beamline, is improving battery technology through Saskatchewan and prairie-based plant materials. And I have to say that was really interesting, that part. Mr. Toby Bond, from right here in Saskatoon, is an industrial scientist who helps with enhanced oil recovery, pipeline integrity, and sustainable mining practices. Victoria Schramm joins the group as a communications and outreach liaison. And of course, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Norris. Mr. Norris needs no introduction here, but he is the senior government relations officer at the Canadian Light Source. He, of course, served as minister for many portfolios here in government. He is my predecessor, Mr. Speaker, and the second best MLA for Saskatoon University. He is a tireless advocate for the CLS and the City of Saskatoon. And so, Mr. Speaker, I would ask all members of the Assembly to welcome these folks to their Legislative Assembly.
Recognize the member for Swift Current.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I request leave for an extended introduction, please.
Members requested leave for an extended introduction. Is leave granted? Recognize the member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. From August 9th to the 18th, Saskatchewan was well represented by athletes, coaches, and mission staff at the 2019 Western Canada Summer Games in Swift Current and across southwest Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, to you and through you, I'd like to introduce some athletes, coaches, and mission staff seated in your gallery who are part of Team Sask at the Games. And I'd ask them to give a wave as I go through and give their names, starting with Ron McLean. Ron is a middle distance runner from Regina who won a gold medal in the 800-meter and 1,500-meter races at the Games. An important note, Ron led Team Sask to sweep the podium in the 800-meter race. Connor Dodds. Connor is relatively new to the sport of rowing, but he didn't let that show at the Games, earning a silver medal in the single sculls event. Brendan McKenzie. Brendan was the coach of Team Sask's triathlon team and is the high-performance coach of Triathlon Saskatchewan. Brenda Colby. Brenda was one of the rowing coaches for Team Sask and has a strong history in competitive rowing. She earned bronze medals at the 1984 and 1990 World Rowing Championships, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, also in the gallery today are mission staff members Mark Bracken, the chef de mission, Greg Perot, operations and logistics, and Karen Lawson, communications and media. Thank you to all of the athletes, coaches, and mission staff for your amazing commitment and contribution to the success of the 2019 Western Canada Summer Games in Swift Current. Thank you for your commitment to sport and for making our province so very proud. I ask, Mr. Speaker, that all members please join me in recognizing and welcoming these guests to their Legislative Assembly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Yorkton.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. It's always a pleasure to introduce family in this assembly, and in your gallery is some of my most important family members. My oldest daughter, Caitlin Cuthill, and her daughter, our granddaughter, Malaya. Along with them is my younger daughter, Ryan Cranbill, with her daughter, Winslet, and son, Otto, and the newest addition to our family, Crew. So I ask all members to welcome my family to their Legislative Assembly. And while I'm on my feet, Mr. Speaker, another great class from the Yorkton Regional High School back home in Yorkton, grade 10 class of Mr. Perry Ostapowicz, who is also the coach of the Championship Raider Gritters that just won their championship here recently, Mr. Speaker. Along with Perry is Mr. Corey Johnson. There's 34 students with them, Mr. Speaker, and as is customary, they send me messages and I give them shouts out. So along with this group are Caleb O'Donnell, Carly O'Donnell, Jade Gerling, who Jade, I've known her since she was just a little baby, Jacob Nelson, Josh Lykud, Anashwara Regu Puda Parambo, Andrew Brown, Connor Anderson, Precious Bear Yuzakapi, Joshua Needham, Jade Hermanson, Colby Witherspoon, Finley Lonaway, Cameron Wilson, and Lance Bermeo. Mr. Speaker, I ask all members to welcome these fine students and their teachers to their Legislative Assembly.
Yeah, last call for introductions. Oh, come on. He's got to be a relative. Presenting petitions. Oh, recognize the member for Cumberland.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to present a petition on behalf of Northern Saskatchewan residents that the Saskatchewan Strategy for Suicide Prevention Act was introduced in 2018 but has not been passed because it has not received support from the Sask Party government. That suicide continues to affect families throughout Saskatchewan. That the rate of suicide among First Nation girls is 29 times higher than other girls. Mr. Speaker, we're receiving letters of support from leaders, Northern Lights School Division, New North, also 35 municipalities are giving letters of support. We're getting letters from chiefs. We're getting letters from people wanting to make sure that the government understands how important this bill is. And the people that have signed this petition, how serious it is. So at this point, I will read the prayer, Mr. Speaker. We in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call upon the Sask Party government to develop and implement a comprehensive strategy to address suicide in Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, this petition is signed by hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of residents. I so present.
Recognize the member for Regina-Pasqua.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to rise today to present a petition from citizens who are opposed to the federal government's decision to impose an unfair and ineffective carbon tax on the province of Saskatchewan. I do like to read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan take the following action: to cause the government of Saskatchewan to take the necessary step to stop the federal government from imposing a carbon tax on the province. Mr. Speaker, this petition is signed by good citizen of Sunningdale, Borden. I do so present, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Regina-Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise once again today to present petitions on behalf of concerned citizens, small businesses, businesses and communities all across Saskatchewan as it relates to the Sask Party's government's decision to impose the PST onto construction labour. Of course, the Sask Party government hiked the PST and expanded it to a whole bunch of goods. It basically doubled the take on the PST. It's hit families hard. The average family is now paying more than $800 per year more than they were just 4 years ago in PST each and every year, Mr. Speaker. And when it comes to the construction sector and the imposition onto construction labour, quite simply, it's the epitome of a job-killing tax. Sadly, the results speak for themselves. We see permits down all across Saskatchewan. We see projects that have been shelved, important projects, and we see thousands of hardworking tradespeople who have been forced out of their employment, and so many out of Saskatchewan in the pursuit of employment. Certainly a loss for them and their family, but a tremendous loss for us as a province. And the prayer reads as follows. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party government to stop saddling families and businesses with the costs of their mismanagement and immediately reinstate the PST exemption on construction, stop hurting Saskatchewan businesses and families. These petitions today are signed by concerned residents from Moose Jaw, Paradise Hill, and Saskatoon. I so submit.
And as a member for Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to present a petition yet again calling on the Sask Party government to call by-elections in Regina Walsh Acres and Saskatoon Eastview. And the people signing this petition today want to bring to our attention the following: that the seats in the Legislative Assembly for Regina Walsh Acres and Saskatoon Eastview are currently vacant. And that's because of a loophole in the Legislative Assembly Act that by-elections are not legally required to be called in Regina Walsh Acres or Saskatoon Eastview because the former MLAs did not resign before August 6, 2019. They resigned just a few weeks later in September. Now, unless a by-election is called, the constituents in Regina Walsh Acres and Saskatoon Eastview will go without representation for nearly 14 months until the provincial election is held late in 2020. But we know the Premier has the power and the authority to call these by-elections, and even though the legislation isn't required, it is morally the right thing to do. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to read the prayer. The prayer that reads as follows: respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan urge the Premier to call by-elections in the constituencies of Regina Walsh Acres and Saskatoon Eastview. And the people signing this petition, Mr. Speaker, come from Saskatoon Eastview and Regina Walsh Acres. I do so present. Thank you.
Recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to present a petition calling on the Sask Party government to fix the crisis in our classrooms. Those who have signed the petition wish to draw our attention to the following: that the Sask Party government's cuts mean falling per-student funding and fewer supports for students who need extra assistance, that the Sask Party government's cuts leave educators without the resources that they need to support student learning, and that the Sask Party government's cuts are ignoring overcrowding in our classroom and they are refusing to track and report on classroom sizes. Mr. Speaker, the lack of funding for school infrastructure has also led to crumbling and overcrowded schools, and the Sask Party government's failure to invest in classrooms is having serious consequences today and will continue to do so into the future until this crisis is addressed. I'll read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call upon the Sask Party government to immediately fix the crisis in our classrooms by properly funding the most important investment that we can make in our children. Mr. Speaker, those who have signed this petition today reside in Prince Albert. I do so present.
As a member of Saskatoon-Newtana.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm rising again today to present a petition calling for this government to save the northeast and small swales of Saskatoon. This is signed by over 240 people today, Mr. Speaker, and these petitions are coming in every day. What they would like to bring to our attention is the following. The Ministry of Highways is planning a 4-lane, high-speed highway around a part of Saskatoon and through the swales. The northeast and small swales of Saskatoon provide food and habitat to a number of endangered and declining species and many others not listed yet as endangered. They're part of our shared natural heritage and include rare fescue grassland and high-quality functional wetlands. Mr. Speaker, the provincial government, they say, is neglecting its environmental protection duties to adequately protect these wild species, and it also includes failing to develop legislation according to principles this government already agreed upon in the National Accord for Protection of Endangered Species. Also, the concern is this government is failing to uphold and honour the intent of the Wildlife Act, the Wildlife Habitat Protection Act, and the Wild Species at Risk regulations. Mr. Speaker, I will read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the provincial government to suspend planning for the Saskatoon Freeway and development around the swales until a regional cumulative effects assessment has been completed. Update the Wildlife Act and expand the list of wild species protected by provincial regulation. Recognize the swales as an important ecological habitat and designate them as protected areas, and ensure adequate long-term funding for research, management, and enforcement to protect the swales for generations to come. Mr. Speaker, the bulk of the people signing this petition today are from Saskatoon, but there are also individuals who have signed from Rostern, St. Brew, Warman, Hague, Regina, and Hanley. I so submit.
Reading and receiving petitions, statements by members. Recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On September 26th, I had the pleasure to attend Rock Cancer at the Conexus Arts Centre. It was a packed house and all in support of the new 4D CT simulator at the Ellen Blair Cancer Clinic. This event featured a performance from Regina's own Garage Band. The Garage Band is made up of a very fine cast of community leaders. John Hopkins, Mayor Michael Fougere, Murad El-Khatib, Steve Compton, Frank Hart, and David Malloy. After our friend and community leader John Hopkins was diagnosed with prostate cancer, this crew came together to raise money for cancer. It was a moving event, with John courageously sharing his personal story, and that included a tribute to all cancer survivors at the event. Garage Band also performed on the rooftop of the Fat Badger at lunchtime on June 26th. It was a fun event and just a beautiful day, Mr. Speaker. Through these events, this crew has raised a remarkable $1,320,000, including a $500,000 donation from the members of Conexus Credit Union. Without doubt, the new 4D CT simulator here in Regina will help to serve and improve the lives of so many. I'd like to ask all to join with me in sending love to the inspirational John Hopkins and thanking the Garage Band and all those that stepped up to rock cancer. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
As a member for Melfort.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 2019 was quite the year for Tiana Zimmerman, an Engelfeld High School student. Tiana traveled to Dubai for the Special Olympic World Games, where she won gold in the women's 4x50-meter freestyle relay and bronze in the 800-meter freestyle. Mr. Speaker, her incredible accomplishments earned her the Special Olympics Canadian Female Athlete of the Year. And for those who know Tiana best, Mr. Speaker, her accomplishments in and out of the pool are especially impressive. Tiana went from being a girl who struggled to make eye contact and hated to be the center of attention, to becoming a confident young lady who walked onto a stage in front of thousands to give a heartfelt acceptance speech. Tiana says that her success seems surreal, and she is worried that this last year has only been a dream. But it was not, Mr. Speaker. She has earned every award she received and worked hard in and out of the pool to become the champion that she is today. So thankful for her parents, Tiana speaks of the day that they made her abandon her life jacket at her first swim practice, and they've continued to be her biggest supporters and fans every step of her way. Mr. Speaker, I invite all members of this Assembly to join me in congratulating Tiana Zimmerman on all of her incredible achievements. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
And as a member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, in 1883, the Government of Canada opened the first federally sponsored residential school in Canada. The Battleford Industrial School was located on a site south of Battleford and was open until 1914. There were 74 Indigenous children buried in the cemetery in the school in the years it was open. In May of 2017, community members led by Eleanor Sunchild, Sharon Burns, and Benedict Feist created the Battleford Industrial School Commemorative Association to work to provide protection for the site. The association applied for provincial heritage designation following the municipal heritage property designation in early 2018 to ensure its conservation. Last month, the Battleford Industrial School Cemetery received provincial heritage designation. The main goal of the project was to bring greater awareness and attention to the history of residential schools, day schools, and colonial policies in European settlements of Saskatchewan. Eleanor Sunchild and organizers wanted to make sure that community members were aware of the local history of colonization in the Battlefords area. These important efforts flowed from the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action on missing children and unmarked burials. Benedict Feist was quoted saying, "The cemetery is an important place for all community members to better understand the intergenerational impacts of the residential school system." I ask all members to join me in recognizing the important work of the Battleford Industrial School Cemetery Association in successfully establishing provincial heritage designation for the site, and thank them for their continued commitment to honor the children buried at the school.
Recognize a member for Saskatoon Stonebridge, Dakota.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, sometimes you hear stories that genuinely touch your heart and affirm your faith in humanity. And I would like to share such a story of true kindness from Saskatoon. As we know, every year the Royal Canadian Legion sells poppies for Remembrance Day. Unfortunately, this year, one Saskatoon pharmacy, which happens to be the neighborhood pharmacy in the area I grew up, had its poppy funds stolen. After learning about this, the Saskatoon Atom Bobcat Pirates hockey team sprung into action. To replace the money, these young players shoveled sidewalks, donated their allowances, some even donated their birthday money, Mr. Speaker. And keep in mind, these hockey players are only 9 and 10 years old. 2 weeks after the poppy collection container was stolen, the team had raised $355.28, and they were adding up cash donations right up until the minute they presented the money to the chair of the Saskatoon Poppy Campaign at the Saskatoon Legion. I think we would all agree that their coach, Mr. Faneuf, their families, we all should be very, very proud of these boys for their natural, guileless generosity. And I would like to ask all members to join me in thanking the young men of the Saskatoon Atom Bobcat Pirates hockey team for displaying such leadership and compassion in their community.
Recognize a member for Saskatoon University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the MLA for Saskatoon University, I have the honour of attending the installation of the new president of St. Thomas More College at the University of Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, Dr. Carl Still was appointed as the 12th president of St. Thomas More. St. Thomas More is a Catholic undergraduate liberal arts college that is federated with the U of S. Mr. Speaker, Dr. Still has had an esteemed career with the college. He joined the St. Thomas More Philosophy Department in 1995 and later served as the department head. From 2006 to 2016, he was dean of that college as well. Dr. Still teaches and researches the history of Western philosophy with a focus on the Catholic intellectual tradition. He is also an accomplished author with 4 books to his credit and numerous scholarly articles as well. Of his appointment, Dr. Still said, quote, "It is both humbling and uplifting to be asked to serve as the president of St. Thomas More College, where I have served for the past 24 years. I look forward eagerly to working with all members of this extraordinary academic community." End quote. I now ask all members to please join me in congratulating Dr. Carl N. Still in his new role as president of St. Thomas More College. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
As a member for Regina University.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. On November 9th, the Leopoldus Golden Suns defeated the Holy Cross Crusaders 28-15 at Mosaic Stadium to win the Saskatchewan High School Athletics Association 6A football title. This provincial title capped off a perfect season as the team went undefeated through the regular season action, even against another high school football team, Mr. Speaker, that's home to a certain quarterback I spend a lot of grocery money on. Mr. Speaker, this is the 6th time the team has hosted the provincial trophy since 2012. Fans were treated to a great game and an excellent display of athleticism, coaching, and sportsmanship from the Suns. We got used to hearing his name all season as a playmaker, Mr. Speaker, but Golden Suns tailback Riker Frank, rushed 25 times for 138 yards. He also had 6 catches for a total of 102 yards, including a 19-yard touchdown. Now, folks might know there was a little wager on this game, Mr. Speaker. The member from Saskatoon, Churchill Wildwood, and I decided to put something on the line in support of our respective schools, and I encourage members to watch the highlight reel of that member drinking a raw egg. But I want to thank her for being a really great sport. Congratulations to the Suns, players and coaches for a great season. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
And as a member for Saskatoon Westview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last night, the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters held their annual members' meeting at the Hotel Saskatchewan. The annual meeting is meant to highlight Saskatchewan's dynamic manufacturing sector. The Saskatchewan creators are known around the world for being industry leaders in advanced engineering and manufacturing technologies. The meeting is also meant to announce the Saskatchewan Manufacturer of the Year Award. This year, the prestigious award was given to Crestline Coach Limited. Crestline Coach is a Saskatoon-based company and a global leader in ambulance and specialty vehicle manufacturing. Mr. Speaker, it is also a Canadian distributor of small to mid-sized commercial buses. Crestline is a proud employer of over 250 diverse employees and ships its products to more than 33 countries worldwide. Mr. Speaker, their manufacturing abilities alone should demonstrate why Crestline won this year's award. But they are more than just a manufacturing company. Crestline prides itself on fostering a progressive and safe environment for its employees. The company also maintains a strong community-focused vision by providing opportunities for its employees to engage and connect with the community. Mr. Speaker and members of this Assembly, please join me in congratulating Crestline Coach for being recognized as the 2019 Saskatchewan Manufacturer of the Year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question period. I say, sadly, recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are joined today by Chief Ronald Mitzwing and Barry Chalafu, CFO of the band for Makwa-Sagagan First Nation. It's a community that has been suffering a terrible tragedy in recent days and weeks, and the Chief has taken the extraordinary step of declaring a state of emergency after the death by suicide of a 10-year-old girl, which was the 3rd such death in 3 weeks. There have been 9 attempted suicides since her death. This is a terribly tragic situation for that community, and sadly, Makwa-Sagagan is not alone, as we know that many northern communities have faced similar stories in recent years. We know that First Nations people in our province are 4 times more likely to die by suicide. First Nations girls are 29 times more likely to die by suicide. Mr. Speaker, what will the Premier do to not just respond to today's state of emergency, to the situation in Maguasagagan, but prevent this ever happening in any other community?
Recognize the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to the Leader of the Opposition, and thank you to Chief Mitswing and Barry Chalafour for coming down today to advocate on behalf of the members of their community. And let me say, Mr. Speaker, that suicide, Mr. Speaker, is an absolute tragedy, Mr. Speaker. And this is a community that has been rocked not only by one suicide, but by a number of attempted suicides, Mr. Speaker. And the loss of a family member, a community member, Mr. Speaker, but in particularly the loss of a child is especially tragic in our community and in our province, Mr. Speaker. And our hearts go out to the family and to the friends and to all of those in the community, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, just prior to question period, I had the opportunity to have a discussion, Mr. Speaker, with Chief Mitswing and Barry Chalafour. I understand this morning that the Minister of Rural and Remote Health, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Social Services, as well as the Deputy Premier, had an opportunity to sit down to ensure that the resources that are available in the government of Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker, are being deployed into this community, Mr. Speaker, but also to ensure that the resources that are available are being deployed in unison with the needs of the community, and to collaborate not only with the community, but to provide the opportunity to join our collaboration and our resources with the federal government as well, Mr. Speaker. This is no time for us to discuss jurisdictional issues, Mr. Speaker. This is a time for us as a government, as leaders in the community, governments of all levels, to ensure that we are providing just the resources that are necessary for this community and the family members.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Premier and the ministers for meeting with Chief Mitswing and Barry and paying attention to what's happened in Maguasagagan. It's extremely important. Fortunately, missing from that meeting and missing from the Premier's answer today was a commitment to a suicide prevention strategy for the province. These deaths are preventable, Mr. Speaker. We've been talking about a suicide strategy prevention in this House for a number of years now, and no action has been taken. Mr. Speaker, it's essential that a suicide strategy prevention be put in place. We've seen that they work. In Quebec, when they introduced such a strategy, they decreased overall suicides by 30%. They decreased youth suicides by 50%. It's an extremely important step. Last year, the Premier allowed a bill for a suicide prevention strategy to die on the order paper, a bill introduced by my colleague from Cumberland. He's reintroduced that bill this session. Will the Premier commit today that this session we will pass the Saskatchewan Suicide Prevention Strategy Act?
Recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, in the immediate term, what the government of Saskatchewan is doing, Mr. Speaker, is providing the supports into the community, for the community of Maquissahigan, Mr. Speaker. That includes providing mental health and addiction staff that are trained in the risk assessment, in suicide risk assessment, Mr. Speaker, in the community, in particular with a focus on our youth in that community, Mr. Speaker. That has come about through a number of conversations that the Minister of Rural and Remote Health has had with community members, as well as the Minister of Social Services through his office is providing 11 counsellors and therapists on the ground, Mr. Speaker. That is part of the immediate supports that are being provided, and there is more to come if it is required, Mr. Speaker, and we will work closely with the community to ensure that is the case. Mr. Speaker, in the medium term, the Ministry of Health has been discussed in the floor of this legislature and outside, but the Ministry of Health is completing a jurisdictional scan across this nation, Mr. Speaker, looking at other provinces and what they have in place with respect to suicide strategies to see if there are any gaps in the services that are currently being provided here in this province, Mr. Speaker, and what some of those services that may be provided in other areas of this nation, Mr. Speaker. And if those gaps are identified, we most certainly are going to fill those gaps, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that is the medium-term strategy in this province, is to have a look across the nation to see what is occurring in other provinces, Mr. Speaker, and to share those best practices and to implement those best practices where there may be gaps in this province.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, they're looking for gaps. They're looking for gaps. Children are dying in northern Saskatchewan. There are gaps. there are very obviously serious problems in this government's approach to suicide. There's about 30,000 to 40,000 people in northern Saskatchewan, depending where you draw the line. Dozens of suicides per year, many, many more attempts. I think if this was happening in Moose Jaw, in my town, about the same number of people, we would see a government falling all over itself to find solutions. Why, Mr. Speaker, has this government been so complacent on this file? We've been bringing it up for years, so complacent. Is it because they're northern children? Is it because they're Indigenous children? Is it because it's not their problem, Mr. Speaker? Why have they been absent, not just on a suicide strategy, they've been absent on poverty reduction, absent on northern economic development, absent on the crystal meth crisis, absent on acting on the TRC recommendations and closing the inequalities gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, Mr. Speaker. In short, all of the things that prevent the hopelessness that would lead to a young girl taking her own life, Mr. Speaker. Absent on those files. We have a bill in front of us. It's not going to answer all those questions, but it's a good bill. The question, Mr. Speaker, for the Premier is, will he pass that bill? It doesn't matter whose idea it is. What matters is that we take action. Will this Premier, for once, put people before politics and do the right thing?
They're here. They're here. Recognize the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what I would say to Chief Mitswing here today is that we will not be absent in the support of your community. Mr. Speaker, the government of Saskatchewan will engage with you and will work very closely with you to support the family members, to support the people in your community, and to support the children in your community, Mr. Speaker. I give you my word on that here in this legislature today. Mr. Speaker, I said the Ministry of Health is doing an interjurisdictional scan. Mr. Speaker, we are looking at best practices across this nation. Mr. Speaker, we are looking at best practices across this nation, Mr. Speaker, to find out if there are areas where there are services that are being provided that may not be being provided here in this province, Mr. Speaker, with an interest to taking those services and implementing them here in the province, Mr. Speaker, to share those best practices that are having effective results in other areas of Canada, to share those with the people in the communities of this province, Mr. Speaker. This is some of the work that the Ministry of Health is doing, Mr. Speaker, and they have identified to date, Mr. Speaker, 9 of 13 provinces and territories that do have suicide prevention or mental health and addictions plans that are in place and less than 10 years old. And that includes, Mr. Speaker, the 10-year mental health and addictions plan that is currently in place here in the province of Saskatchewan.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the question was very clear. We know there are gaps. The gaps are clear because the suicides are still happening, and there's been no action to address them. These stories are not new. The situation in Magua-Segagan is not new. It is a terrible tragedy today, happening right now, but it is something that was so foreseeable and so preventable. And we've been asking for a suicide prevention strategy for years. It is not now the time to be looking at jurisdictional gaps, jurisdictional scan. We know that there's a better way, and we know this government has refused to follow it. Will the Premier commit today? It's a simple commitment. Will we pass this bill this session?
Hear, hear. Hear. Recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, with respect to what is occurring in this province, Mr. Speaker, I referenced the 10-year Mental Health and Addictions Action Plan introduced in 2014 in this province. Mr. Speaker, that plan came about after extensive consultation with stakeholders and individuals across the province of Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. In addition to looking across the nation as to what is happening and sharing best practices with respect to not only suicide prevention, Mr. Speaker, but also with respect to addressing mental health and ultimately at times addictions, Mr. Speaker, I would reference the work of the Minister of Health and Mr. Speaker, this government through the Council of Federation table. Mr. Speaker, having a symposium this coming spring, a symposium of premiers and health ministers and community-based organizations, I might add, Mr. Speaker, where we are able to come together and share some of the effective tools, the effective best practices that are being utilized in this nation in an interest to making them replicable, Mr. Speaker, in other areas of the nation. Mr. Speaker, there is no one answer that is going to solve these very real challenges that are ahead of us. Mr. Speaker, it is going to take hard work, months and years of hard work, Mr. Speaker, and the people of this province can know that this is a government that is committed to doing just that.
Recognized Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No explanation there why, knowing that this takes months and years. For years, this government has refused to implement a suicide prevention strategy, despite all the evidence pointing in that exact direction and that great need, Mr. Speaker. And it seems that the Premier doesn't like any idea that isn't his own idea, even if it will help people. Even if it will make a real difference, if he didn't come up with it, he doesn't want to do it. On November 6th, Mr. Speaker, we wrote a letter to the Prime Minister, shared it with the Premier, asking for help for farmers in a difficult harvest season. A wet fall that's resulting in high prices for grain drying, folks having to pay high carbon price payments because of grain drying, producers that have been hit hard and need help. We offered that, and the Premier, how did he respond? He said, no, not interested in the Assembly. And then a few days later, when he's talking to the Prime Minister, well, then he's in favour of it. Yesterday, the Minister of the Environment, when we raised this, he attacked that plan again. That same afternoon, the Premier met with the Deputy Prime Minister and brought it up again. So why does the Premier say one thing in the Assembly and the opposite when he's meeting with the federal government?
Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
Recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, with respect to the carbon taxation policy on natural gas, with respect to the carbon taxation policy on anyone or any industry in the province of Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker, the position of this government has been extremely clear. With respect specifically, though, to natural gas, Mr. Speaker, I brought that up with the Prime Minister when I met him. I brought that up with the Deputy Prime Minister yesterday when I had the opportunity to have a meeting with her. Mr. Speaker, we have been very clear. This is not a policy that is helpful in reducing emissions here in the province of Saskatchewan. It's a policy that is helpful in reducing the profits of our industries, Mr. Speaker, and ultimately driving investment to other areas of the nation. Mr. Speaker, we have been clear. My question would be, is why has the Leader of the Opposition and the NDP in this province and across this nation not been clear?
Here. Here. Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Saskatchewan people expect leaders to come forward with common sense solutions, to work on their behalf. Farmers today that are hurting, that are paying high bills, they expect this government to be advocating on their behalf, Mr. Speaker, not stamping their feet when they don't get their way. I'm hopeful from what I've heard from the meeting with the Deputy Prime Minister that there was at least some sort of a first step towards a more productive relationship there, Mr. Speaker. So my question for the Premier is this: how did that conversation go with the Deputy Prime Minister, and is there hope that farmers in Saskatchewan, with the support of this government, because you know the opposition supports it, will get a rebate on their carbon price payments for grain drying this year?
Hear, hear.
Recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, this is very interesting, Mr. Speaker, that we see now the Leader of the Opposition, the members opposite, that all of a sudden want to stand up for the hardworking farmers in the province of Saskatchewan.
No credibility. They're all on this side.
Mr. Speaker, on February the 12th, 2019, the Leader of the Opposition said that his position actually was very clear. We think a price on pollution is a reasonable thing.
Right.
He didn't say it's a reasonable thing, but not for farmers, Mr. Speaker. On March 3rd, 2018, he said, I think that a carbon pricing is a model that works. Right. Mr. Speaker, he didn't say that it's a model that works, but not for farmers, Mr. Speaker. Right. We were the party that had said repeatedly, Mr. Speaker, this is a damaging tax. This is a tax that not only reduces our profits in this province, Mr. Speaker, but will reduce investments, ultimately reduce jobs, Mr. Speaker. We have consistently stood up for the sustainable industries in this province, including agriculture, Mr. Speaker, and that includes when they come to town to have a protest across town here, Mr. Speaker, about a year ago, Mr. Speaker, when the Leader of the Opposition had quite a bit more to say about that industry.
Yeah. Recognize Leader of the Opposition.
The Premier appears to have forgotten that he's introduced a price on carbon for heavy emitters in the province. Right. The Premier seems to think that because he's changed how he's mischaracterizing my position, that it's a change in position, Mr. Speaker. But let's talk about that conversation with the Deputy Prime Minister once more, Mr. Speaker. We know that conversation included discussion of a number of issues. Well, here's a major issue. The suicide problem in this province. Was that raised with the Deputy Prime Minister? You've got one of the major leaders on an issue that has both national and provincial jurisdiction, a state of emergency on a First Nation in Saskatchewan. Yesterday, with Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, did the Premier discuss the suicide problem in our province?
Recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, this is an issue that has been raised, Mr. Speaker, with the federal government on a number of fronts. It has been raised by a number of ministers with their respective ministers. Mr. Speaker, it has been discussed at the Council of Federation table. Mr. Speaker, that is how we came up with the initiative of which this province is co-chairing with the territory of Yukon, Mr. Speaker, of which we are co-chairing, Mr. Speaker, to share best practices with respect to how we are treating and assisting and supporting those that are challenging or struggling with mental health issues, Mr. Speaker, across this nation. Mr. Speaker, we're going to continue to engage not only with our federal government, but with our municipal leaders here within the province of Saskatchewan to support all of those, Mr. Speaker, in particular at times when we are challenged with what we have seen recently, Mr. Speaker, in the community of Makwasahegan, and Mr. Speaker, with the suicides and the suicide attempts there.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
I guess that's a no, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, all session we have been raising concerns about hallway medicine and capacity pressures in our hospitals. We've heard about a patient in a Regina hallway in a hospital for a week. We've learned about a patient death in Saskatoon. We're hearing about system-wide short staffing, and we've uncovered hush memos instructing doctors to keep quiet about their concerns. The common thread in all of this is resources, Mr. Speaker. The minister told this House that, quote, financial resources are not to get in the way of rectifying this problem, and, quote, they have all resources at their disposal. Can the minister advise this House exactly what funding has been provided to the health region since these issues have come to light?
Good question.
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've discussed the issue of the emergency room wait times and hallway medicine many times over the last couple of weeks in this House. I've had many discussions with senior officials at the Saskatchewan Health Authority as well as the Ministry of Health, Mr. Speaker. They're well aware that any resources that they need outside of existing budget line items, Mr. Speaker, will be made available to them. Mr. Speaker, we have an issue here that isn't unique to Saskatchewan. Right across the country, hospitals are grappling with this issue. Mr. Speaker, many times in the House, I've went through the steps that will be taken both short-term and long-term to help to rectify this. Mr. Speaker, I have discussions with the CEO and senior officials at SHA many times every week. I talked to him just recently, I believe it was yesterday, Mr. Speaker. He informed me that, again, while the situation is still serious, Mr. Speaker, we believe that as a result of the good work that SHA officials are doing, that it's trending in the right direction.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
I guess the answer to the question is none, Mr. Speaker.
Yep. Another no.
Folks on the front lines are saying they don't have the tools they need to provide adequate care. In a letter copied to the minister last week, SEIU West said, quote, hallway care continues to prevail on a daily basis. They're also concerned about staffing at the new Children's Hospital, saying that in less than 2 months since opening, they've had 52 understaffing reports. 52. These include concerns related to equipment not working, unsafe backup power systems, staff not being replaced when they're away, and incredibly burdensome workloads. To the minister, what is going on at the new Children's Hospital, and does he think this sounds like a hospital and a care team that has enough resources?
Hear, hear.
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, let's put this in perspective. There's issues with the start of a new facility, Mr. Speaker. We built a state-of-the-art children's hospital. It wasn't very long ago, Mr. Speaker, that the opposition was fear-mongering, saying we weren't going to be able to recruit specialists to work in the hospital, Mr. Speaker. There's just a few very hard-to-recruit specialties left to recruit there, Mr. Speaker. Constantly fear-monger. I find this amazing, Mr. Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition, a doctor himself, said that he was going to do politics differently. But, Mr. Speaker, what does he do? He fear-mongers in this Assembly every chance he gets, more than Dwayne Lingenfelter did, in fact, Mr. Speaker. He uses gotcha politics every chance he got. It's always a secret memo every day. Mr. Speaker, it's amazing to me. He actually put that in a book he wrote. He talked about gotcha politics. He referred to the media as having the attention span of a goldfish, Mr. Speaker. Why he would poke his finger in there, I don't know, Mr. Speaker. Maybe he thinks it's okay because hardly anybody bought the book.
There's a member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, patients across this province, health care.
Member for Regina Rosemont, please don't engage the galleries. Member.
Mr. Speaker, the patients
Minister
across
Health.
this province, frontline healthcare workers, they deserve better than this minister's talking points that he reverts to when he doesn't have an answer.
Here.
This letter also suggests that hallway medicine is not an anomaly in Saskatchewan hospitals.
Oh, really?
It highlights concerns that on the 5th floor at St. Paul's Hospital, a permanent call light has been installed for patients receiving care in the hallways.
Wow.
If a patient in a hallway has a fever, the prescription shouldn't be more call bell. When patients are receiving care in hallways, additional staff aren't being added to make sure patients get safe and timely care. Does the minister agree with the statement that this issue, quote, sends the message that hallway care has become the normal provision of care in the system, and does he think this is acceptable?
Good question.
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, again, many times over the last couple of weeks, we've talked about what the SHA is doing to help the issue with hallway medicine. Mr. Speaker, among those issues is there's a new medicine bed unit being built at RUH right now, Mr. Speaker. We've added more beds to the system. Mr. Speaker, there's still strains on the system. We understand that. But, Mr. Speaker, again with the fear-mongering, look at what's actually happened as far as capital builds in this hospital, Mr. Speaker. Last question, she was criticizing the new Jim Pattison Children's Hospital, Mr. Speaker. Did they build it? No, they didn't, Mr. Speaker. This government did. Did they ever get around to building the Humboldt Hospital? No. This government did. Mr. Speaker, 14 long-term care facilities this government built while they were closing hospitals.
As a member for Saskatoon Newtown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier this morning at the Crown and Central Agencies Committee meeting, government members voted down what should have been a non-controversial motion. All that was asked is that the Sask Party bring the CEO of West Cap Management, Grant Cook, to come to the next committee meeting when we take a closer look at the annual reports for the Saskatchewan Immigrant Investor Fund and the First Nations and Métis Fund. These are funds that we have paid West Cap Management more than $10 million to manage, but the funds are now $16 million in the hole, Mr. Speaker. Wow. So all we want to do is to be able to ask some simple questions. So we're going to ask the minister now. Will the minister for Crown Investments Corporation then ensure representatives from West Cap are present at the next committee meeting, or will he block transparency like the government members of the committee did this morning?
Yeah. Recognize the Minister of Crown Investments.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The fund that she's talking about, Mr. Speaker, is the Head Start on Home program, Mr. Speaker, which was introduced in 2011, Mr. Speaker. It was a very successful program. West Cap Management has done business with the government for many, many years, Mr. Speaker. In fact, Mr. Speaker, they had the NDP, when they were in power, they hired the West Cap to manage the First Nation and Métis Fund and the CICU Management Fund. Mr. Speaker, this was a great program for the people of Saskatchewan at a time when housing was very short, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, 90% of the people, Mr. Speaker, that qualified for this program earned under $70,000 a year, Mr. Speaker. And they were first-time home buyers, Mr. Speaker. And we think that program was very successful. And, Mr. Speaker, it's not a practice, Mr. Speaker, to bring this individual to committee.
Here, here. Here.
Ministerial statements. Introduction of bills. Ministerial statements. Didn't see a stand up. Recognize the Minister.
I was not. I have difficulties with that, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am proud to rise today to announce the Ministry of Justice and Attorney General will be working with the Law Society of Saskatchewan and other partners to develop enhanced sexual violence education for legal professionals and other justice stakeholders in the new year. As a province, we are dedicated to reducing sexual violence and to supporting victims of sexual violence in as many ways as possible. It's hard to measure the devastating impact sexual violence can have on its victims, and it's critical that everyone working in the justice system recognize this impact when working with complainants in sexual violence cases. In recent provincial and federal reports, survivors of sexual assault and victims of gender-based violence have consistently identified the need for increased confidence in the justice system. One of the specific issues they noted was the need for additional education on sexual violence for justice system professionals. Though educational opportunities exist for lawyers and other justice professionals around sexual assault and gender-based violence, we feel it's an area that could benefit from an ongoing annual educational program. As a result, in the new year, we will be implementing enhanced education to be made available for judges, lawyers, and other justice system professionals to ensure the privacy and dignity of complainants in cases involving sexual violence. One of our primary goals of this program is to ensure the Saskatchewan legal community and other justice system stakeholders are informed about legal protections afforded to complainants in a criminal prosecution. By offering this education, we will ensure all justice system stakeholders have the necessary skills and information that they need to ensure complainants are afforded all of the legal protections available to them. Although we're currently in the developmental stage, our goal is to provide this program twice a year, once in Regina and once in Saskatoon. The Ministry intends to work collaboratively with the legal community, the courts, and victim services to prepare this education program. We hope to involve representatives from all of these groups to ensure different perspectives are presented to and considered by participants in the program. The program will cover a wide range of subject matters, such as criminal code education on sexual offences, available supports for sexual assault survivors, courtroom tools such as witness screens, and trauma and its effects. Mr. Speaker, we feel this is an important step forward in supporting survivors of sexual violence in our province. As we continue to develop this program, we are also hopeful that other jurisdictions may take note and consider developing similar programming. We look forward to working with the legal community in the new year to establish this programming. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to thank the Minister for providing me with a copy of his remarks beforehand. We've said this many times in the House, Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan has the second highest rates of sexual assault in the country, and this move by the government is a positive step forward. As the Minister had mentioned, survivors often state that one thing that is lacking is confidence in our justice system, Mr. Speaker, and not unduly. So this will be a positive step forward in terms of working to instill back some confidence in our justice system. We've been advocating for this somewhat quietly with others, Mr. Speaker. I wrote a letter to the minister earlier this month, asking him on his position around mandatory sexual assault training for provincially appointed members of the judiciary. So I'll take this as his response to the letter that I sent him earlier this month. And we're happy to see this. We would like to see this as a first step, though. The next step should be working toward making this a mandatory requirement for members of the judiciary, Mr. Speaker. This would put what the government has just announced in line with the bill that was proposed by former interim leader of the Conservative Party, Rona Ambrose, Mr. Speaker, who put forward a bill calling for mandatory sexual assault training for new members of federally appointed judges, Mr. Speaker. We think that's important that the next step be that this is mandatory for provincially appointed members of the judiciary. I know that federal bill did not pass, but I understand that there is work to move that bill forward from all parties federally, Mr. Speaker. As with all types of anti-harassment training, it's often those who need the training the most are the ones who won't take it, which is why it's important that the next step be mandatory. I understand that some of this work has happened, and there's been a bit of a pilot in terms of continuing professional development, education around sexual assault survivor awareness, training amongst the legal community that just occurred. I understood it was very well received, so we're really happy to see that the government is supporting this and moving this forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Introduction of bills. Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 200, the Saskatchewan Employment Amendment Act 2019, be now introduced and read a first time.
It has been moved by the Minister that Bill number 200 be now introduced and read a first time. Pleasure Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall this bill be read a second time? Recognize the Minister.
Next sitting of the Assembly.
Next sitting.
Item number 2, Honourable Mr. Makowski.
Recognize the Minister, Parks, Culture and Sport.
I move that Bill number 201, the Alcohol and Gaming Regulation Amendment Act 2019, be now introduced and read a first time.
It's been moved by the Minister that Bill number 201 be now introduced and read a first time. Pleasure Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall this bill be read a second time? I recognize the Minister.
Next sitting of the Assembly.
Next sitting.
Item number 3, Honourable Mr. Harrison.
Recognize the Minister of Trade and Exports.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that Bill number 202, the Election Amendment Act 2019, be now introduced and read a first time.
It has been moved by the Government House Leader that Bill number 202, the Election Amendment Act 2019, be now introduced and read a first time. Pleasure Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall this bill be read a second time? Recognize Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I request leave to consider all the remaining stages of Bill number 202, the Election Amendment Act 2019, later this day on government orders.
Government House Leader has requested leave to consider all the remaining stages of Bill number 202, the Election Amendment Act 2019, later this day on government orders. Is leave granted? Leave has been granted.
Item number 4, Ms. Mowat.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 619, Public Interest Disclosure Provincial Health Authority Amendment Act 2019, be now introduced and read a first time.
Hear, hear.
It has been moved by the member that Bill number 619 be now introduced and read a first time. Pleasure Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall this bill be read a second time? Recognize the member.
Next sitting of the Assembly.
Next sitting. Presenting reports for standing special committees. Orders of the day. I have a number of responses to rulings made for yesterday. On Tuesday, November 26, 2019, the Opposition House Leader raised a point of order to say the Minister of the Environment mischaracterized the position of the Opposition on pipelines during question period. The Opposition House Leader said she thought the remark was unparliamentary. The Government House Leader gave his opinion of the facts, to which the Opposition House Leader responded with a second point of order. In that point of order, she took exception to the remarks of the Government House Leader and provided a list of instances when the Opposition put its support of port pipelines on the record. I committed to review the record on the original point of order. I could only find one instance when the Minister referred to pipelines in his responses to the questions put by the member for Regina North East. He said, "When it comes to an opportunity to support the federal government, Mr. Speaker, on the carbon tax or on certainly issues around pipelines, we know which side they stand on." The Minister did not explicitly assert the opposition's position on pipelines, but certainly the government House Leader did in his response to the point of order. That takes me to the broader issue of this incident. In essence, what happened yesterday was the use of a point of order to air a grievance over how public policy positions are depicted in debate. There is no doubt in my mind that this is a very sensitive issue for members on both sides of the chamber. Yesterday, the situation quickly escalated into mayhem when members on both sides started hurling insults and accusations across the floor. It led to a third point of order about unparliamentary language. This is not the first time I've been asked to rule on this kind of situation. I refer you to my statement of April 23, 2018, which was made in response to a similar incident. This is not a matter that can be resolved by the Speaker. It is a matter for all members to pause and give careful introspection on the standards they want for debate in this chamber. There will always be disputes over the facts of any matter. As I previously stated, it is not unparliamentary to criticize statements made by members as contrary to the facts. This is the raw material of debate, and this place is a deliberative body. But I ask you, what standards do you want for this place? Yesterday brought to a head a matter that I think has been festering for some time. I sense this through the language that both sides have used in question period. Of particular concern is the way you have characterized each other when putting forward the issues of the day. I implore members to reflect on our code of conduct, and in particular, a commitment to have respect for differences and fairness in political dealings. I will now respond to the point of order raised by the government Deputy House Leader. He alleged that the member from Athabasca shouted across for everybody in the Assembly to hear that the government House Leader was lying. Upon review, the member from Athabasca was clearly heard to have used unparliamentary language. The language used by the member has consistently been ruled out of order. I now ask the member from Athabasca to withdraw the comment and apologize. Recognize the member from Athabasca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I withdraw the comment and apologize.
Okay, it's acceptable on that. I'll move on. Okay, so I've got another statement. Yesterday, Tuesday, November 26, 2019, the opposition House Leader raised the question of privilege under the provisions of Rule 12 of the Rules and Procedures of the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan. I received the notice at 2:58 p.m. Upon receipt of this notice, in accordance with the rules, the government House Leader has been informed of the details of the case and the proposed question of privilege. It is the responsibility of the Speaker to determine if a prima facie case of privilege has been established. Contempt of the Assembly is a serious charge, which requires careful examination of this case and this Assembly's practices and precedents. However, I've not had sufficient time to carefully consider all matters related to this question, so for this reason, I shall defer my ruling. I'd now like to table the business and financial plan for the year ending March 31st, 2021 by the provincial auditor. Orders of the day.
Written questions. Question number 54 asked by Mr. Forbes.
Recognize the government whip.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to order the answers to questions 54 to 63.
Ordered 54 to 63.
Government orders, second readings. Bill number 202, the Elections Amendment Act, the Honourable Mr. Harrison.
Recognize the Minister of Trade and Exports.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I wish to announce to the Assembly the receipt of royal recommendation for the following bill. This was not received in time to appear in the order paper. Therefore, I beg to inform the Assembly that His Honour the Lieutenant Governor, having been informed of the subject matter of Bill number 202, the Election Amendment Act 2019, recommends it to the consideration of said Assembly. Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 202, the Election Amendment Act 2019, be now read a second time.
Government House Leaders moved second reading of Bill number 202, the Election Amendment Act 2019. Is the Assembly ready for the question? Nobody. The question before the Assembly is the motion moved by the Government House Leader that Bill number 202, the Election Amendment Act 2019, be now read a second time. Is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Second reading of this bill.
To which committee shall this bill be committed? Recognize Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I designate that Bill number 202 be committed to the Committee of the Whole on Bills, and the said bill be considered in Committee of the Whole on Bills immediately.
This bill stands committed to the Committee of the Whole on Bills.
Committee of the Whole on Bills.
I do now leave the chair for the Assembly to go into Committee of the Whole on Bills.
Let everyone know that this. Members, the item of business before the committee is Bill number 202, the Election Amendment Act 2019. I would like to mention to the members that this is a very lengthy bill, and we will be going clause by clause, so it's going to take a bit of time, so please bear with us and we will get through this. Clause 1, short title, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 2, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 3, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 4, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 5, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 6, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 7, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 8, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 9, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 10, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 11, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 12, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 13, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 14, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 15, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 16, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 17, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 18, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 18, where are we? Where's 19? Page 8, okay. Clause 19, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 20, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 21, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 22, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 23, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 24, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 25, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 26, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 27, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 28, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 29, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 30, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 31, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 32, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 33, is that agreed? Carried. Okay, where's 33, 34? Clause 34, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 35, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 36, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 37, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 38, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 39, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 40, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 41, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 42, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 43, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 44, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 45, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 46, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 47, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 48, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 49, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 50, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 51, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 52, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 53, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 54, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 55, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 56, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 57, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 58, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 59, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 60, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 61, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 62, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 63, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 64, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 65, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 66, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 57, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 68, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 69, is that agreed? That's carried. Clause 70, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 71, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 72, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 73, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 74, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 75, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 76, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 77, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 78, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 79, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 80, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 81, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 82, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 83, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 84, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 85, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 86, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 87, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 88, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 89, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 90, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 91, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 92, is that agreed? That's carried. Clause 93, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 94, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 95, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 96, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 97, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 98, is that agreed? That's carried. Clause 99, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 100, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 101, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 102, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 103, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 104, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 105, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 106, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 107, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 108, is that agreed? That's carried. Clause 109, is that agreed? That's carried. Clause 110, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 111 coming into force, is that agreed? That's carried. No. Her Majesty, by and with the advice and consent of the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan, enacts as follows. Bill number 202, the Election Amendment Act 2019. I recognize the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I move that the committee report the bill without amendment.
It is moved that the committee report Bill 202, the Election Amendment Act 2019 without amendment. Is that agreed? Carried. I recognize the Government House Leader.
Mr. Chair, I move that the committee rise, report progress, and ask for leave to sit again.
It's been moved by the Government House Leader that the committee rise, report progress, and ask for leave to sit again. Is that agreed? Carried. That concludes the work of the committee.
I recognize the chair of committees.
Mr. Speaker, I'm instructed by the committee to report Bill number 202, the Election Amendment Act 2019 without amendment.
The Government House Leader may proceed to move third reading.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that this bill be now read the third time and passed under its title.
It has been moved that Bill number 202, the Election Amendment Act 2019, be now read the third time and passed under its title. Assembly ready for the question? Pledge the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Third reading of this bill.
When shall the committee sit again? I recognize Government House Leader.
Next sitting, Mr. Speaker.
Next sitting.
Government orders, second readings, item number 1, Bill number 197, the Automobile Accident Insurance Amendment Act 2019. Honourable Mr. Hargrave.
Recognize the Minister of Crown Investments.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise today to move second reading of an act to amend the Automobile Accident Insurance Act. Mr. Speaker, the Automobile Accident Insurance Act governs how motor vehicle accident injury and death benefits are paid. The change is proposed to one of the appeal provisions under the Act for which SGI and the Ministry of Justice share responsibility. The change would require that both SGI and a claimant first have leave of the Court of Appeal before appealing a decision of the Court of Queen's Bench or a decision of the Injury Appeal Commission to the Saskatchewan Court of Appeal. The Act currently provides for an automatic right of appeal on a question of law. This means that before the merits of an appeal are verified, a full panel of the court is required to invest time in preparing for the hearing and then must entertain oral argument and render a decision. The Chief Justice of the Court of Appeal for Saskatchewan has requested this amendment to avoid requiring a full panel of the court to be engaged on an appeal that lacks merit. This change better respects the court's time and makes things more efficient. At the same time, it maintains the right to appeal a decision of the Injury Appeal Commission or the Court of Queen's Bench. Mr. Speaker, another proposed change removes references of any law in the Act and replaces them with references to, quote, any law of any jurisdiction. There is a risk under the current wording that any law could be narrowly interpreted to mean Saskatchewan law only. Specifically, the proposed change clarifies that when a license or a driving permit is suspended, revoked, or cancelled under any law of any jurisdiction, their driver's license is automatically suspended, revoked, or cancelled in Saskatchewan. It also clarifies that the surrender of someone's license or other driving permit to a judge under any law of any jurisdiction automatically cancels that person's driver's license in Saskatchewan. And lastly, it clarifies that it is a condition of the first part, property damage insurance, and third-party liability insurance that vehicles cannot be operated in violation of any laws of any jurisdiction, restricting weight, use, hours of operation, territory, number of passengers, and transportation of goods. There's also a variety of housekeeping changes, mostly around making language gender neutral as per best practice. With that, I move second reading of the Automobile Accident Insurance Act.
It has been moved that Bill number 197 be now read a second time. Assembly ready for the question? Recognize the member for Athabasca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And again, I'm very proud to take my place today and respond to Bill 197, the Automobile Accident Insurance Amendment Act 2019. Mr. Speaker, we pay very, very close attention to any changes in our crowns, especially ones being proposed by the Saskatchewan Party government. And the reason why, Mr. Speaker, that the official opposition is so defensive against the Saskatchewan Party government when it comes to any legislation pertaining to our crowns, Mr. Speaker, is their history. They told us that the Information Services Corporation, the Land Titles Branch, wasn't for sale even though it was making $14 million. What did they do, Mr. Speaker? They sold it. They said STC was not for sale, Mr. Speaker. What did they do? They wound it down and sold off parts of STC that we will never recover again, Mr. Speaker. And now we look at SGI and what the legislative agenda is for SGI. And this particular bill, Mr. Speaker, we have to be very, very careful as to what the Saskatchewan Party wishes to do when you talk about the Automobile Accident Insurance Amendment Act 2019. It is important and very imperative, Mr. Speaker, that the people of Saskatchewan, and in particular the opposition, Mr. Speaker, pay very, very close attention to some of the changes regarding the laws governing our Crown corporations. And this is one particular Crown corporation that people of Saskatchewan value. Mr. Speaker, I can tell you from some of the conversations I've had with various members of my family, some of them live in Alberta, and they talk about the incredible insurance rates of Alberta, of things that they have to pay for that the Saskatchewan people do not have to pay for. So, Mr. Speaker, when we look at the Automobile Accident Insurance Act, we have to make sure that there's nothing in these legislative changes being proposed by the government and this particular minister, Mr. Speaker, that would weaken or disadvantage SGI in any way, shape, or form. We have found it on a consistent basis, Mr. Speaker, that their practice as a party is to simply devalue our crowns and to hamper our crowns and box in our crowns for becoming the robust crowns that they were envisioned to become when they were first created for and by the people of Saskatchewan. And we should all know that the Crown Corporation sector itself is a sector that is highly valuable to the province of Saskatchewan, not only in the sense of the jobs created, Mr. Speaker, and the services provided, but the fact that the people of Saskatchewan can call these Crown corporations their very own, Mr. Speaker. So we are very, very defensive. We are very, very wary of the history of the Saskatchewan Party when it comes to our Crown corporations. This is the purpose, Mr. Speaker, that we pay very, very close attention to any bills and any legislative changes being proposed by the Sask Party government. And that is why, again, I feel very confident as the official opposition. We have a number of people that are our lawyers, Mr. Speaker, that can go through the Automobile Insurance Act page by page and see what changes are being proposed. While the minister can assure people that some of the changes are housekeeping in nature and changing a few languages or interpretations of gender-neutral language here and there, Mr. Speaker, there are also changes, some very subtle changes that may have a profound effect on the viability of our crowns, and in this particular case, SGI. So we are taking an extra moment to really go through what's being proposed in this particular bill. We're going to take our time to make sure that none of the activities described in this bill hamper or box in or disadvantage SGI in any way, shape, or form. That is our role as the official opposition. And I would remind people of Saskatchewan to be very careful in any legislative changes when it comes to our Crown corporations, because we have found on a continual basis as the opposition that any way, shape, or form, if the Saskatchewan Party can weaken the Crowns to justify selling the Crowns to pay off the debt that they racked up while they're in power, Mr. Speaker, the people of Saskatchewan ought to know that is their strategy, that is their plan. So as much as they get up and say, SaskTel's not for sale, SGI is not for sale, well, Mr. Speaker, they said that about STC, they said that about the Land Titles branch, Mr. Speaker, and the list goes on. They are not champions of the Crowns, and no matter what language that they use, Mr. Speaker, the people of Saskatchewan know full well that there was a secret committee concocted by the Saskatchewan Party to look at how they could sell off the Crowns. They know it, we know it, and the people of Saskatchewan will soon know it full hand, Mr. Speaker. So when it comes to the Crowns, I tell the people of Saskatchewan, the opposition are going to look very carefully at what changes are here, and to remind all the people of Saskatchewan that the Saskatchewan Party are interested in selling off the Crowns. Their job is not finished until we're deep in debt, we have no Crown corporations left, and the economy is in the tank, and then we'll see the Saskatchewan Party head out of Dodge, Mr. Speaker, leaving nothing but a legacy of debt, leaving nothing but sale of our Crowns, Mr. Speaker, and they continue to knock Saskatchewan down in many, many shapes and forms, Mr. Speaker. So I'd say again, when it comes to our Crown corporations, and this particular, the Automobile Accident Insurance Act, Mr. Speaker, this bill that's housed within SGI, I remind the people of Saskatchewan, be very careful. There is a plan by the Saskatchewan Party to do away with our crowns, and we have to make sure that these bills do not hamper our crowns in any way, shape, or form, as I've said time and time again in this Assembly, and we will undertake to do that, and we will be watching very, very carefully as to what this minister and that party have for our crowns. Mr. Speaker, they are itching to sell off these crowns so they can justify paying off the debt they racked up over the last 12 years. And Mr. Speaker, the people of Saskatchewan will soon find that out, and they will oust this government and never to have them come back to ruin the future of our Crown corporations. So as I said at the outset, there are people within our caucus that are much more aware of the values of SGI, Mr. Speaker. There are some legal minds within our caucus that will evaluate and look at the circumstances behind the changes in this legislation, and to encourage people of Saskatchewan to also to participate in the process, to give us any information that they deem is relevant as the changes to this particular bill. So it's very, very important that the people of Saskatchewan know, and the Saskatchewan Party know, anything to do with our crowns, any legislative agenda, no matter how minor that they describe it, and Mr. Speaker, no matter how nefarious they try and hide it, we will pay attention, because the people of Saskatchewan do not want these crowns sold. The crowns belong to the people of Saskatchewan, not the Sask Party government, Mr. Speaker. So on that note, we have a lot more to say on this particular bill. We will be having some robust debates on the value of some of the changes being entertained in this particular bill. And Mr. Speaker, the underlying theme from the opposition is to protect these crowns, because the people of Saskatchewan deserve to own these crowns, and the crowns create a great service, not only in job creation and services, but also a legacy that our grandchildren can be proud of, and the fact that they do own SaskPower, SaskTel, and SGI. So, Mr. Speaker, on that note, I move that we adjourn debate on Bill 197.
Members move to adjourn debate. Pleasure assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Second readings, item number 2, Bill number 198, the Traffic Safety Amendment Act 2019. Honourable Mr. Hargrave.
Recognize the Minister of Crown Investments.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise today to move second reading of the Traffic Safety Amendment Act 2019. Mr. Speaker, there are quite a number of changes to this Act. Many of them are housekeeping or incidental amendments aligning regulations and legislation. But I'll go through a few of the others. Mr. Speaker, distracted driving is a serious problem in Saskatchewan, as you and members of the Assembly are well aware. We've been talking about this issue a lot, and SGI has been running awareness campaigns to draw attention to this deadly driving habit. Driver distraction or inattention is one of the top causes of collisions, injuries, and fatalities on Saskatchewan roads. In 2018, it was a factor in more than 6,000 collisions, 774 injuries, and 22 deaths. We conveyed in the throne speech last month and last week announced that penalties would be getting tougher in an effort to combat distracted driving. Starting February 1st, 2020, the cost of a ticket will more than double to $580. The cost of subsequent tickets will escalate to $1,400 for a second offence and $2,100 for a third offence. Mr. Speaker, there are also vehicle impoundment and demerit point consequences. Mr. Speaker, in Saskatchewan, we have 2 laws that address distracted driving. One is driving while using or holding a cell phone, and the other is driving without due care and consideration. Currently, there is some inconsistency in the sanctions between the 2 offences. Drivers caught for a second cell phone offence within a year are subject to a vehicle impoundment. However, for driving without due care and consideration, impoundments don't happen until the 3rd offence. The proposed amendments would ensure consistency between these 2 similar charges, with impoundments becoming a sanction on the second offence for both. Impaired driving also continues to be a problem in this province, Mr. Speaker. It's one of the leading causes of deaths on our roads and highways. Our government has made significant efforts through tougher legislation and penalties, increased enforcement, and awareness efforts to help bring down the number of people killed or injured due to impaired driving. Ignition interlock devices prevent the driver from operating a vehicle if they have alcohol in their system. If a driver blew into the device, and in reading determined that they had consumed alcohol, the vehicle won't start and can't be driven. These devices are a deterrent to impaired driving. In Saskatchewan, if a driver is charged under the criminal code with an impaired driving offence, the driver is suspended from driving until the charge is resolved in court. During this suspension period, the driver cannot participate in the ignition interlock program. In addition, if convicted of an alcohol-related offence, the driver cannot participate in the ignition interlock program until they have completed mandatory educational programming. The proposed change would permit participation in the ignition interlock program prior to the disposition of the charge after the driver serves a 90-day suspension. If convicted, eligible drivers would also be able to participate in the ignition interlock program before completing the mandatory education. This change is intended to remove barriers that might prevent drivers from installing an ignition interlock, which will hopefully result in higher participation and lower instances of individuals driving while disqualified. The change also allows individuals to maintain employment and manage personal and family responsibilities prior to a court disposition. Mr. Speaker, another aspect to this bill is when there is a collision involving a semi, the consequence can be very devastating. Earlier this year, we made it mandatory for drivers who are seeking a Class 1 commercial semi-license in Saskatchewan to take a minimum of 121.5 hours of training. Mr. Speaker, while the implementation of the mandatory training for Class 1 vehicles was done through regulations, changes to rules around drivers licensing for non-residents require a legislative change. As a result, the requirement for mandatory truck training currently does not apply to non-residents. Today, non-residents can drive semis using their foreign commercial driver's license. These changes to the Act ensure non-residents are also subject to the mandatory training program. Mandatory training for the agricultural sector begins to be phased in as of March 1st, 2020. Having these Act changes in place will ensure those requirements also apply to temporary foreign workers. We want all new semi-drivers in the province to be held to the same standard to safely operate these heavy vehicles. Mr. Speaker, another Act amendment relates to transportation of children in taxis or rideshare vehicles. Currently, it is the responsibility of the driver of those vehicles to ensure children under the age of 16 are properly restrained. The change would require parents and guardians accompanying the child to be responsible for that instead. Another revision to the Act, Mr. Speaker, allows law enforcement to lay a charge for an intentional obscured license plate. So that would not include things like mud or snow, rather when it is intentionally obscured in a manner to deliberately prevent the plate from being read accurately. Mr. Speaker, it has come to the attention of to SGI's attention that drivers are being charged with operating an unregistered vehicle in circumstances where the driver could not reasonably be expected to know that the vehicle is unregistered. Examples include employees operating a company vehicle or an employee of a service garage test driving a vehicle that had been dropped off for service. Currently, legislation enables police to charge only the driver of the vehicle, not the owner. This change will give law enforcement the authority to charge either the owner of or the driver of the unregistered vehicle. Mr. Speaker, another Act change relates to autonomous vehicles. We know that it's only a matter of time before autonomous vehicles become more commonplace, and in some jurisdictions they already are. So while they are not prevalent today in Saskatchewan, we know we have to get it ready. We would want these vehicles to operate we would not want these vehicles to operate unconditionally on our roads. We need to ensure the right measures are in place to address registration, licensing, and enforcement. Some changes to the Act are required to prepare for testing and deployment of autonomous vehicles. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I will mention that administratively, SGI treats a provincial driving while disqualified offence similar to how it treats a criminal code offence. It comes with an automatic license suspension for a minimum of 1 year. SGI does not believe the same sanctions are appropriate in this case, though this amendment will address that. Mr. Speaker, those are the most notable Act changes. As I mentioned earlier, there are a number of other incidental amendments, including some to align regulations and legislation. With that, Mr. Speaker, I move second reading of the Traffic Safety Amendment Act 2019.
It's been moved that Bill number 198 be now read a second time. Assembly ready for the question. Recognize the member for Athabasca.
Again, I thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity to present our initial discussions around this particular bill, Bill number 198, the Traffic Safety Amendment Act 2019. Now, Mr. Speaker, the Minister gave a very brief description of what some of the changes were going to be that are contained in this particular bill. We have done a very quick scan of the bill itself to make sure that we share some of the information with the people. And certainly, Mr. Speaker, as we look at some of the changes within the bill, it's all about perspective and certainly what the necessary effects, what the objectives are, and the changes of some of these bills. So we're really quite interested in what the statistics that would drive a certain change within parts of this bill, like what those would suggest. And we'll have the opportunity to grill the Minister on some of the decisions on these particular bill, the items in this Traffic Safety Amendment Act that would be of some concern to the people that are using or that are driving our roads and streets. Now, Mr. Speaker, the bill itself specifies the driver's license required for the operation of Class 1 motor vehicles. It updates sections numbering to accommodate offense provisions in the Summary of Offences Procedures Regulations. It adds new definitions to Section 75 as it pertains to automated driving systems, automated vehicle permits, and connected vehicles, because, Mr. Speaker, as we've had discussions in this Assembly before, the whole idea and the concept of driverless cars is something that we think the future is going to bring. How does this impact SGI? How does it impact traffic safety? All these issues are very complex in nature, and that we must make every effort to try and understand as best we can how this interchanges with how we're operating and driving our vehicles today versus 5 years from now and 7 or 8 or 10. So I think it's important that people look at the automated vehicle scenario as something that would be an opportunity to learn about before that reality hits Saskatchewan street. And Mr. Speaker, that is, of course, a whole new concept for us to begin to understand. And that takes time for people to adjust to some of these new marketplace opportunities attached to the automated car options. It also authorizes the administrator to issue permits for the operation of automated vehicles and connected vehicles. It creates an offense for the operation of an automated vehicle or connected vehicle, and it incorporates the term signing officer to accommodate a change in terminology with respect to vehicle safety standards and inspections. And the last two changes that we want to particularly highlight from this particular bill, it obviously updates the language to reflect the standards applied by peace officers when administering a field sobriety test. And finally, Mr. Speaker, it incorporates definition of drug recognition evaluator. So, Mr. Speaker, these are some of the things that we've picked from the legislation to highlight the issues that we think are important for people to also pay attention to some of the other points that the Minister raised. I know my colleague from Saskatoon Riversdale and my colleague from Cumberland were both part of a panel that talked about traffic safety. They have a breadth of information and wide knowledge of some of the statistics and the challenges of driving through Saskatchewan roads and streets and towns and villages, Mr. Speaker. So they will certainly have a lot to say about the changes in this particular bill, and that's why it's important that we give them the time to do so. And as we speak, staff members and those particular members are evaluating some of the changes to the legislation that are being presented today. So it's important to note, as I've indicated time and time again, if there's anybody out there in the public that wishes to participate, pay attention to this legislation, because there are changes coming that will affect everything from cell phone use to automated vehicles to the field sobriety test that we talked about. to the drug recognition evaluator, what that's all about, because, Mr. Speaker, these are the realities of today's environment, and all I think any person that wants to do, including the official opposition, is to make the streets safer for our children and certainly for all of the people that use our highways and byways. So on that note, Mr. Speaker, I move that we adjourn debate on Bill number 198, the Traffic Safety Amendment Act 2019. I so move.
Members move to adjourn debate. Pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Second readings, item number 3, Bill number 199, the Opioid Damages and Healthcare Costs Recovery Act. Honourable Mr. Ryder.
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand today to move the second reading of Bill 199, the Opioid Damages and Healthcare Costs Recovery Act 2019, and amendments to the Health Administration Act 2019. This legislation will help support our province in our participation in British Columbia's class action lawsuit against opioid manufacturers and distributors. Mr. Speaker, as we all know, there is a public health crisis in Canada arising from the use and abuse of opioids. In the words of the Provincial Auditor of Saskatchewan, opioids are causing a growing number of overdoses and deaths in Canada. While opioids serve a role in managing pain, the potential harm is clear in the wake of this crisis, with many people suffering from serious addiction issues. The drug companies and distributors have played a big role in causing this tragic current situation. They've used deceptive marketing practices and concealed the potential risks of opioids. Unfortunately, we cannot undo the effects of these actions, but we can hold them accountable for the enormous human toll and financial costs they have caused. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan gave its public approval to BC's class action lawsuit against opioid manufacturers and distributors. This class action is brought on behalf of a proposed class of all federal, provincial, and territorial governments and agencies that have paid healthcare, pharmaceutical, and treatment costs related to opioids from 1996 to the present. The claim is that drug companies deceive prescribers and patients about the risks and benefits of opioids, and they have seriously harmed individuals, families, and the public health care system. Mr. Speaker, to support the lawsuit, we are introducing new legislation, Bill 199, the Opioid Damages and Healthcare Costs Recovery Act 2019, and amendments to the Health Administration Act 2019. This legislation will give Saskatchewan the ability to have a direct action against opioid manufacturers and distributors. Also, amendments to the Health Administration Act will allow the Health Minister to take direct action on behalf of government to recover past and future health care costs. Currently, the Act only allows government to take subrogated action to recover the cost of health care benefits. Mr. Speaker, participating in BC's legal action is one of a number of steps that our government is taking to address the opioid crisis and its devastating impact on individuals, families, and communities. For example, we are opening a number of rapid access to addictions medicine clinics across the province. RAM clinics provide immediate access to addictions treatment by multidisciplinary teams, and in just 2 days' time, we will be celebrating the grand opening of Saskatchewan's first RAM clinic, located in Prince Albert. And in the 2019-20 budget, we've made additional investments in alcohol and drug services and new addictions beds. We know more needs to be done, and we'll continue working hard to help those affected. Mr. Speaker, I am now pleased to move the second reading of Bill 199, the Opioid Damages and Healthcare Costs Recovery Act 2019, and amendments to the Health Administration Act 2019. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
It has been moved that Bill number 199 be now read a second time. Is the Assembly ready for the question? Recognize the member for Athabasca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and again, I'm pleased to take my place to do the initial second reading response as it pertains to Bill 199, the Opioid Damages and Healthcare Cost Recovery Act. Now, this is a very interesting bill, Mr. Speaker. As the Minister alluded to, it allows the province of Saskatchewan to position themselves in a class action suit to talk about the misuse and overprescription of some of the drugs that are creating dependency, and in some cases, the ultimate unfortunate and untimely death of some of the users of these drugs. And Mr. Speaker, it's important to note exactly the cause of why we're having this situation to begin with. it's a long overdue action plan, Mr. Speaker, because we've seen between April 1st, 2018 and March 31st, 2019, that there were 441,354 opioid prescriptions filled in Saskatchewan. There are another 359,681 prescriptions dispensed to treat addictions such as methadone. Last year, there were 119 deaths due to opioid toxicity in our province, and according to the auditor's report, Mr. Speaker, the ministry does not know if provincial pharmacies contribute to Saskatchewan's opioid crisis, as the distribution of medication is not properly tracked. So the question you have to ask yourself, Mr. Speaker, as we look at some of the changes being proposed in the bill, is or some of the changes being enacted in this bill to allow the government to proceed with their class action suit, is why are people self-medicating, Mr. Speaker? What is the issue that is causing so much dependency on some of the opioids that we're making reference to, and why are people in Saskatchewan self-medicating to those levels? So it's really important to begin to talk about how we begin to speak of some of the challenges facing many of our families. And the families I'm speaking about, Mr. Speaker, are from all throughout the province, because this challenge is not just specific to one group of people or one region. It affects us all throughout the entire province. So the first question we would have is, why are people self-medicating to the extent that we are, Mr. Speaker? The second question is, if the province is positioning themselves to be part of a class action suit, and as the minister made the connection from his perspective, made the connection that pharmaceuticals are part of the problem by not properly disclosing to some of the clients some of the addictive nature of some of the opioids that they're using. So it's important to understand if that is the connection, and if there is the ability to pursue a class action suit against these pharmaceuticals, then the question that we would obviously have is, what is the target area in terms of dollars? Is it a huge amount of money? Is it 100 million? Is it 200 million? Is it much more than that, Mr. Speaker? One would assume, if you look at the name of the bill, the part of the bill's name is healthcare cost recovery. Now, Mr. Speaker, we've had some experience with this particular issue as it pertains to the tobacco industry. We're finding that many governments are now suing the tobacco companies for some of the costs incurred to the healthcare system, because obviously smoking 20, 30 years ago may not have been an issue, but over time people understood the health nature or the addictive nature of the tobacco use, and the fact that there was some alarming health challenges attached to smoking. And then that became part of the effort of many governments across the country to try and deal with the health costs of people that smoke. Well, Mr. Speaker, in this particular bill, it is much the same vein of thought, in the sense that the government now is saying, well, some of the overprescription, the overuse of some of the opioids in our province may have led to addiction, because the pharmaceutical companies did not properly identify these challenges with their product, as the tobacco companies didn't when they started their industry. So now it gives the government the opportunity to sue the pharmaceuticals in question, and to sue them not just for the damages to the people, but to the cost to our healthcare system. So it's really a complex process, Mr. Speaker. As I've mentioned, thank goodness we do have those of legal minds and trained legal minds, I might add, within our caucus, because they can certainly understand the difference between a class action lawsuit versus an individual claim, versus the different levels of court systems that are required to respond to different levels of lawsuits. It becomes quite complicated, Mr. Speaker, and as I mentioned before, I'm not a lawyer by any stretch of the imagination, but it's important to note that there are those lawyers within our caucus that would be very, very capable in understanding how these class action lawsuits work, and whether this legislation fits the bill, so to speak, to ensure that we do have the awareness. Now, Mr. Speaker, it is my hope that if there is cause found that there was a dereliction of duty and negligence on the part of the pharmaceutical companies, that if there is the courts that do agree with the assertion by the province that they willingly knew that this would create addiction and therefore that they were derelict in their responsibility as a vendor of these products, that therefore they should be now responsible to not only cover the health care costs that the province is paying, but the damages to the patients themselves. What kind of revenue stream, what kind of dollar amount would this involve? So I'm really thinking, Mr. Speaker, that it is something that is very, very important for us to assess. And then if that success is made with this lawsuit that the minister made reference to, then what becomes of that money? It is my hope that that there is programs to help people recover from these addictions to opioids, Mr. Speaker. We understand that the federal Liberal government tried to do the same exercise with the whole notion around cannabis. When they legalized cannabis, that they'd use some of the revenue stream to help deal with the drug addictions of the harder drugs that are out in the marketplace. And the jury's still out, Mr. Speaker. Some people do not like the idea. Other people don't seem to mind the idea. So it's important, Mr. Speaker, to point out that there is effort in governments trying to recognize exactly what challenges that the country faces when it comes to the use of illegal drugs like marijuana and the overprescription of opioids within our healthcare system. These are all contributing factors to some of the stats that I made reference to and some of the points that the minister alluded to in his opening statement. So I think it's very, very important that we look at the information within the bill itself, because it would establish causation and quantify the cost of health care benefits. I'm sure there is a formula somewhere to determine that. It allows the government to do calculation of health care benefits on an aggregate basis, Mr. Speaker. These obviously are wordings within the Act that would allow them to properly assess the damages. And, Mr. Speaker, I am certain that within a very short period of time, that a determination of potential revenues, if the lawsuit proceeds and if the provinces are successful, as I'm sure other provinces are, then the question becomes, how do you utilize this particular money? And we hope it's not to backfill expensive P3 projects that run a hook for the next 20 years. And the revenue stream from this effort would go into what it's supposed to do, and that is to reduce costs to our healthcare system and to help people with these addictions. So, Mr. Speaker, it's very important that we look at how the money should be used, and there's tons of ideas around how to properly utilize dollars if this was successful in the court of law in terms of their willingness to go class action. So, Mr. Speaker, the other issue is what are other jurisdictions doing? BC, Manitoba, the territories, Quebec. Is there a uniformity? Is there a uniform approach to this particular lawsuit? And which companies are being impacted? Are they Canadian-based companies? Are they American-based companies? It becomes a very, very complex piece. So while we see there's some value, much as you would with the tobacco strategy in terms of suing some of the companies, there may be a lot of merit. We need to determine that. Now, what I fear, Mr. Speaker, is that the Sask Party, like 99.999% of their initiative is just going through the motion, not really doing anything about these challenges. We hope that this is not the case. So there's a lot more to be said on this particular bill. I look forward to my more learned colleagues' explanation of how the process works, as I'm sure they will explain. And I look forward to some of that input. So until we get that input, Mr. Speaker, I move that we adjourn debate on Bill 199, the Opioid Damages and Health Care Cost Recovery Act 2019.
Members move to adjourn debate. Pleasure assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders adjourn debate. Item number 10, resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 190, the Expropriation Procedures Amendment Act 2019. Ms. Rancourt.
Recognize the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honor to rise today and enter into the debate around Bill number 190, the Expropriation Procedure Amendment Act. This bill does something complicated that's actually quite simple. It's updating the way interest is calculated on a judgment pursuant to the Expropriation Procedure Act, and will provide that interest will now be calculated according to the Prejudgment Act instead of the 6% that's currently earmarked in the section. Mr. Speaker, it makes sense to update it so that it corresponds with other legislation. I'm looking forward to having questions answered to me by members of the committee as well as officials on this bill. So at this point, I'm prepared to allow Bill number 190 to move on to its next stage.
Okay, question before the Assembly. It's a motion by the Minister that Bill number 190 be now read a second time. Pleasure Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Second reading of this bill.
To which committee shall this bill be committed? Recognize the Government House Leader.
To the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Adjourn debates. Item number 11, resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 191, the Business Corporations Amendment Act 2019. Ms. Beck.
Recognize the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Mr. Speaker, it's my honor to rise this afternoon and enter into the debate around Bill number 191, the Business Corporations Amendment Act. There are many changes in this bill, and frankly, the Business Corporations Act is not my area of specialty. However, from what I understand, I believe most of these changes are aligning our Provincial Business Corporations Act with the Canada Business Corporations Act, the Federal Act, Mr. Speaker. It will largely speaking, make ownership interests a bit more transparent when you're looking into those who own various types of businesses. I know that the ministry officials do great work in drafting this legislation, and I have quite a bit of confidence in their capabilities, and I'm looking forward to having the opportunity to spend some time with them to ask some questions of them about this piece of legislation. Mr. Speaker, it's always a pleasure when I have the opportunity to spend some time with justice officials at committee and to facilitate that process. I'm prepared to allow Bill number 191 to move on to its next stage.
I hear the feeling.
Question before the Assembly is a motion by the Minister that Bill number 191 be now read a second time. Pleasure Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Second reading of this bill.
To which committee shall this bill be committed? I recognize the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Adjourn debates. Item number 12, resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 192, the Legal Professions Law Foundation Amendment Act 2019. Mr. Vermette.
Recognize the member for Regina Douglas Park.
It's my honor to rise this afternoon and enter into the debate around Bill number 192, the Legal Profession Law Foundation Amendment Act. Mr. Speaker, this, from what I understand from reviewing the bill, largely is making some fairly minor wording changes with respect to the Law Foundation portion of the Legal Profession Amendment Act. The Law Foundation does extremely important work, Mr. Speaker. For those who don't know, they manage funds that are a pool of funds that are gathered through the interest that's generated off of lawyers' trust accounts. Lawyers cannot keep that interest that's generated off of their trust accounts. It goes into a fund that's managed by the Law Foundation, and the Law Foundation then receives applications for funding projects or nonprofit organizations. Largely speaking, their mandate is to facilitate access to justice initiatives. So you'll see that Legal Aid receives some of this money. The organization I used to work for, Pro Bono Law Saskatchewan, receives some of this money. John Howard Society, I believe, Elizabeth Fry Society, Mr. Speaker. So to say that they do important work in providing funding to organizations who are filling in gaps gaps in access to justice created by this provincial government, Mr. Speaker. As such, we're going to be asking many questions about these legislative amendments, Mr. Speaker, just ensuring that the Law Foundation and the good people that are managing that pool of money are able to continue to do that good work. And to facilitate that discussion, I'm prepared to allow Bill number 192 to move forward to its next stage.
Question before the Assembly is a motion by the Minister that Bill number 192 be now read a second time. Pledge the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Second reading of this bill.
To which committee shall this bill be committed? Recognize Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Adjourn debates, item number 13. Resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 193, the Statute Law Amendment Act 2019. Number 2, Ms. Beck.
Recognize the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honor to rise this afternoon and enter into the debate around Bill number 193, the Statute Law Amendment Act. This piece of legislation is making housekeeping, fairly minor changes to many pieces of legislation, essentially just to update and modernize their provisions. There's many on the list. We often have an amendment act like this come through every session to ensure that the legislation continues to be updated and modernized to reflect current procedure, current language, and all that sort of thing. I'm not going to read every single piece of legislation that this bill is updating, but I am looking forward to asking questions about this piece of legislation at committee. So at this stage, I am prepared, or at this point, I'm prepared to allow Bill number 193 to move on to its next stage.
Question before the Assembly is a motion by the Minister that Bill number 193 be now read a second time. Pledge the Assembly to adopt the motion.
Second reading of this bill.
Did I say carried? I'll say carried anyways. To which committee shall this bill be committed? Recognize Government House Leader.
To the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
During debates, item number 2, resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 179, the Apiaries Amendment Act 2019. Ms. Sproul.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to enter into debate on Bill number 179, the Apiaries Amendment Act of 2019. Several of my colleagues have had an opportunity to weigh in on this piece of legislation already. And yes, as you correctly gesture, Mr. Speaker, the member for Regina Northeast has been advising us very well in his capacity as a beekeeper. So some of the changes that are proposed in this piece of legislation, the minister notes that this legislation will modernize the Apiaries Act and keep it in line with legislation in other jurisdictions. That these changes come after consultation with industry stakeholders and partners, although we'll certainly have a question about which folks have been consulted and make sure that's been fulsome and that we won't see negative impact on our beekeepers across the province. And so some of the other changes proposed here are moving the register into the PID system, so the premises identification system. It's been combined with the beekeeper registry to reduce administrative work, and the argument is that it needs to reduce red tape. So we should ensure that there are no negative implications with this proposal as well. There have been some scientific changes that have come about that have led to some proposals here. The minister suggests that it will allow beekeepers to utilize open feeding of bees over a particular period of time while also minimizing the risk of contaminating honey with foreign sugars, and will allow for better management of disease outbreaks that do occur. It also proposes to increase the maximum fees from $10,000 to $25,000 so that it becomes more of a deterrent in ensuring that beekeeping operations are in line with the rules, Mr. Speaker. There are a couple of questions that we're going to have as we move forward. One of those is what the ministry is planning to do to boost honey production across the province. We know that the industry has faced significant issues lately, and as well as what the plan is to curb the growing use of pesticides that have caused a decline in bee populations. We'll continue to examine some of these concerns as well as consult with stakeholders, but with that I would move to adjourn debate on this bill for today.
Members move to adjourn debate. Pleasure assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourn debates. Item number 3, resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 180, the Miscellaneous Statute, Government Relations, Transfer of Gas, Electrical and Plumbing Functions, Amendment Act 2019. Ms. Beck.
Recognize a member for Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Good to take my place, rise in debate, and offer a few thoughts on Bill number 180, the Miscellaneous Statutes, Government Relations, Transfer of Gas, Electrical and Plumbing Functions Amendment Act 2019. This continues the trend with since the development of TSASC, the Technical Safety Authority of Saskatchewan, and the further consolidation of various licensing and inspection functions within that body. Again, Mr. Speaker, there are a number of questions that we have in terms of the consultation that took place. In the Minister's second reading speech, she refers to consultations that took place with industry and trade associations over 2017 and 18. Again, Mr. Speaker, we're just making sure that is as presented, and we'll certainly do the work of following that up in consultation with the sector. And in terms of the further consolidation of gas, electrical, and plumbing licensing and inspection functions, we'll be, again, interested to see how this works out, Mr. Speaker, because we know that as it stands right now, different of those functions are looked after in bodies such as Sask Energy, Sask Power, and those functions have been there for a reason, Mr. Speaker. And does this improve the circumstance, or does this cause some challenges by locating these functions away from where they should be taking place? And again, Mr. Speaker, we're talking about these are things that have been situated in these different bodies for, in some cases, decades, Mr. Speaker. So is this the best way to do things? Is this, again, one-stop shopping is good, but is that the right place to put it? And we'll certainly look to the Minister for further arguments on that score, and to answer any questions that we might have, of course. But at this time, Mr. Speaker, I'd move to adjourn debate on Bill number 180.
Members move to adjourn debate. Pleasure assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourn debates. Item number 4, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 181, the Mineral Taxation Modernization Amendment Act 2019. Mr. Peterson.
As a member for Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker, and thanks certainly to colleagues for the encouragement. Mr. Speaker, in terms of, I guess, just a word of or an observation off the top in terms of when we see mineral taxation legislation coming forward from this government and this minister, in particular, Mr. Speaker, we're always interested to see what's in the fine print, because sometimes big changes pop up like toast, Mr. Speaker, and of course the sector then has to figure out what's going on. So, Mr. Speaker, we'll be looking at this, and I know that there's a lot of hallelujah chorus goes on about great friends to the industry and all that, but sometimes that doesn't measure up to what's actually taking place out in the sector. And so when you have a budget that drops a significant taxation change on the sector with zero consultation, Mr. Speaker, zero sort of foreshadowing, again, that's on the ledger alongside the different sort of protestations of undying love that go on in the House sometimes, Mr. Speaker. So we'll certainly be taking a close look at this one because, again, you'd like to take all these things on faith, Mr. Speaker, but sometimes that is rewarded most poorly. But with that, Mr. Speaker, I know other of my colleagues will have smarter things on this to say than I, but I believe I'll move to adjourn debate on the Mineral Taxation Modernization Amendment Act 2019.
Members move to adjourn debate. Pleasure to somebody to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourn debates. Item number 1, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 175, the Marriage Amendment Act 2019. Ms. Saar.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to enter into debate today on Bill number 175, the Marriage Amendment Act. There are a number of changes that are being proposed in this legislation. So some of them of note are updating the language used throughout the legislation, removing reference to the Family Service Act, prohibiting the marriage of a person under 16, which I didn't know wasn't already prohibited, Mr. Speaker. Permits the interest of a person to challenge the legal validity of a marriage in the Court of Queen's Bench if there's a presumption that one of the parties to a marriage did not provide valid consent to enter into the contract of the marriage. It amends Section 25 to update references to inpatient facility, which is no longer a defined term in the Mental Health Services Act. It allows a marriage commissioner to charge a fee that is agreed upon by both parties and the commissioner for the marriage ceremony. It establishes that in case the validity of a contract of marriage is established, the court may require either or both parties to be examined before the court or submitted to medical examination. It amends the Will Act to nullify an existing will if a spouse wants to change their will after marriage. This is one of the pieces we're going to be examining quite closely, Mr. Deputy Speaker. There will be significant changes and significant consequences that result from the amendments to the Will Act. We'll also be looking into the fact that the government should have put in place more public consultations to inform the public about these changes and how they might affect them, considering how widespread the institution of marriage is across our province. I know several of my other colleagues will want to weigh in on this as well, but with that, I move to adjourn debate for today.
The member from Saskatoon Fairview has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 175. It's the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourned debates. Item number 5, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 183, the Fisheries Saskatchewan Act 2019. Mr. Forbes.
I recognize the member from Regina Lakeview.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and it is my pleasure this afternoon to rise and enter into debate on Bill number 183, the Fisheries Saskatchewan Act of 2019. Mr. Speaker, as has been previously noted, it has been some time since this particular piece of legislation has been updated. In fact, the last time it was substantially updated goes all the way back to 1994, which is an impossibly long 25 years ago. It's hard to believe it's been that long, but the minister noted in his second reading speech that there were a number of purposes for this piece of legislation being in front of us now. Following review, it was found that there was an opportunity to modernize language, which is fairly straightforward, Mr. Deputy Speaker. He also mentioned that there was an intent to clarify the current intent of the Act. So that's something that I think we'll want to have a little bit of a deeper look into. It was also noted in the second reading speech that there were consultations that took place with the First Nation and Métis communities in the province. Again, as other members on this side have noted, that is very important, especially given the history and the treaty rights to hunting and fishing, and that will be something we'll want to make sure that we have a good handle on the intent and extent of those consultations. It also makes increases some authority to respond quickly to invasive species. Of course, there has been conversation in this Assembly around the importance of ensuring that we have good protective measures against the introduction of zebra mussels in the province. Some information that's come to light in recent years around the incursion of Prussian carp into the province and the potentially devastating impact that could have, if that gets out of control. I believe they can take over up to 90% of the habitat, with 95% of the fish in the ecosystem in as little as 10 years, which of course would be devastating not only for those sport fishers, but for commercial fisheries that exist in our province. I think of the commercial fishery of John Waite that we had the opportunity to visit a couple of years ago up in Buffalo Narrows. So very important again to both sport fishers and commercial fishers in the province, and very important that we get that right. There are also some new provisions in this bill that would give power to the minister to determine the designation of a wild species at risk and augment those listed on the federal list of species at risk. It also would authorize fishery officers to conduct audits and changes to the procedures around inspections and investigations. Again, very important that we are nimble on that. One thing that I wanted to point out or add my voice to, something that the member from Saskatoon Centre also did. Very important that we keep our fisheries healthy. One of the ways to do that, of course, is to ensure that we keep on top of the invasive species at risk. One of the other ways that we need to ensure that fisheries are healthy and robust is to ensure water quality. So, that is another important piece here, of course, maybe outside the mandate of this particular act, but needs to be taken in concert with measures that would look at water quality. Huge concerns about acidification in lakes, particularly in northern lakes, making sure that we have adequate wetlands to filter filter farmland and pollutants before they get into the waterway. Anyway, Mr. Deputy Speaker, all that and more, I'm sure, will be given a great deal of attention by our critic, and I think I've come to the end of my remarks on this bill, so I will move to adjourn debate on Bill number 183.
The member has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 183. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Adjourn debates. Item number 6, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 184, the Fisheries Saskatchewan Consequential Amendment Act 2019. Mr. Forbes.
I recognize the member from Regina Lakeview.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Again, I will rise this time to speak to the Consequential Amendments Act, Bill number 184, regarding the Fisheries Act. Of course, when new legislation is introduced, sometimes that necessitates changes to other pieces of legislation. In this case, this bill would make amendment to the enforcement of the Maintenance Orders Act, as well as make amendments to the Wildlife Act. I think many of the same comments that I've already made would apply here, including the fact that this is something that is in the capable hands of the critic, and I'm sure that there will be further investigation, further consultation. But for that, for the moment, I will rest here and move to adjourn debate on Bill number 184.
The member from Regina Lakeview has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 184. Is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Adjourn debate. Item number 7, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 187, the Administration of Estates Amendment Act 2019. Mr. Vermette.
I recognize the member from Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll enter in briefly here this afternoon with respect to Bill number 187, the Administration of Estates Amendment Act. This is an important act, and certainly we're going to be engaged. Our justice critic will be engaged with stakeholders on this front. We invite all impacted and those with expertise and knowledge in this area to engage as they review this act. Certainly it's important to make sure that that a very thoughtful consultation occurs and that consequences, both intended but potentially the unintended consequences, are understood by government through this process. We'll be there to work in a constructive fashion on that front through the committee process and with stakeholders, and certainly work to make sure that we do all we can to make sure that these changes are in the interests of the public, and that if there's other opportunities to amend or to improve this piece of legislation, certainly that's the constructive approach that we'll be taking. But with respect to Bill number 187, the Administration of Estates Amendment Act 2019, I'll adjourn debate at this point.
The member from Regina Rosemont has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 187. Is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Adjourn debates. Item number 8, resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 188, the Public Guardian and Trustee Amendment Act 2019. Ms. Beck.
Recognize the member from Regina Northeast.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My privilege, of course, to enter into this debate. It's always a privilege that we have to remember that we're representing our constituents and indeed the province when we participate in these debates. Mr. Speaker, as I've noted before, the legislative agenda this sitting is a little lackluster, and frankly illustrates that this government is old, tired, and frankly out of ideas. And every single day we are looking for some evidence that this government has any ideas left to use this legislature to make life better for the people who need help in this province. And every day we see the opposite, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, when I turn to this particular piece of legislation, the bill before us, Bill 188. I see that we are adding the definition of letters of administration to the list of defined terms in the Act. And Mr. Speaker, as a lawyer, as the member opposite has pointed out, I know that definitions and fine print matter, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And while I'm sure this is important, I haven't dug into the details of this particular bill, Mr. Deputy Speaker. What I am sure is that the definition of that is not as important as passing a suicide prevention strategy like the member from Cumberland has proposed. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, when I turn to this bill provides that the public guardian trustee is going to be the official administrator for the province, and it replaces the reference to the defined term next friend in sections 20 and 21 with the term litigation guardian. And I'm sure those are important changes, Mr. Deputy Speaker. But Mr. Deputy Speaker, what about the kids in our classroom with special needs who aren't getting the attention that they need because this government hasn't invested in their education? What about them, Mr. Deputy Speaker? Aren't they important? Mr. Deputy Speaker, this bill also talks about the powers of the public guardian and trustee to act as an applicant for letters of administration in the estate of someone who has passed away. But Mr. Deputy Speaker, what about fixing their broken record on the health care system? At one point in time, this government promised to get rid of wait times. And Mr. Speaker, what we see again and again is more and more hallway medicine. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we see that this bill is setting out the public guardian trustee's authority to administer small value estates. Again, in very limited circumstances, this is an important situation. But Mr. Speaker, what about dealing with climate change? What about dealing and promoting with renewable energy in our province? Where does that come in? Where do we see a bill that deals with that, Mr. Deputy Speaker? It's sad to see this government so out of ideas. Now, one thing that I think is quite interesting about this bill, Mr. Deputy Speaker, it's a little, maybe a little novel, is that this bill provides, from a government who I would say would probably choose to characterize themselves as free marketers, people who don't believe in intervening in the economy. This bill intervenes in the economy and says, if you are a business getting in the business of locating heirs of estates, this government is going to regulate how much they can charge. And Mr. Speaker, I find this passing strange, and it's really, I find it interesting trying to figure out when this government is going to decide when they want to intervene in the economy and when they don't. And for instance, Mr. Deputy Speaker, this sitting, we have another bill before us dealing with the Marriage Act. And in that bill, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the government decided to get out of regulating how much marriage commissioners can charge. But in this bill, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the government decided to set a limit, and they're saying you can't charge more than 10%, and only if you meet these certain criteria. And so, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I just have difficulty trying to figure out what is the rationale. Why does this government decide to intervene in the economy sometimes and decide to get out of it at other times? It kind of reminds me of this government's flip-flops on picking winners and losers in the economy. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, I recall many government members railing against that very idea when they were on the opposition side. But then within months of forming government in 2007, Bill Boyd was out there picking winners who seemed to have close connections to the Sask Party. He was picking winners at the Global Transportation Hub. And even more recently, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the government wanted to legislate rail workers back to work, but they weren't content to let the marketplace and negotiation take its course in that instance. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I find this bill where they say that for some reason they're setting the limits on what air locating companies can charge. I find that to be a bit of a blunt instrument that they're using. Not sure where they came up with the rationale for a 10% of the estate limit. That might be fine in a certain value of estate, but it might be too low in a small value estate, and it might be far too high in a big value estate. So it's really quite curious why they've picked this arbitrary 10% number as the limit for what an air locating company can charge. With that, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm going to move that we adjourn debate on this bill.
The member from Regina Northeast has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 188, the Public Guardian and Trustee Amendment Act 2019. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourn debates. Item number 9. Resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 189, the Coroner's Amendment Act 2019. Ms. Sproul.
I recognize the member from Regina Lakeview.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I rise this afternoon to enter into debate on Bill number 189, which is the Coroner's Amendment Act of 2019. This is a bill, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that has garnered some attention prior to. Of course, it follows the appointment of Clive Wayhill to undertake a review of the Saskatchewan Coroner's Service, a very important review that by a very competent and long-term public servant, of course, former Chief of Police in Saskatoon, and someone who enjoys a great deal of respect, well-deserved respect in the community. So a very important undertaking by Mr. Wayhill. This review resulted in a final report that was released last year that contained 44 recommendations for improvement. Of course, all of this in the context of some very high-profile cases of that were coroner's inquest cases. The minister on November the 18th, 2019, noted that the proposed changes cover a variety of areas, including granting the chief coroner authority to appoint coroners. Currently, that is done by the minister, and allowing an inquest coroner to make recommendations at the conclusion of an inquest in concert with the jury, something that was considered important, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and allowing family members of the deceased to request a review of the chief coroner of a coroner's decision not to hold an inquest. Of course, something that families, in instances when there is question of whether a coroner's inquest would be conducted, of course, would be highly distressing situation. So it does allow, it would be proposed to allow families some say in that decision, which would seem to be an important improvement, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The last piece that the minister noted was that this would allow coroners to reopen investigations in certain cases where new evidence arises. Again, seems to be something that is very reasonable and flows out of the work of those 44 recommendations. I know that the critic has been very active in this file and has been keeping a very close eye, including meeting and discussing with stakeholders. I don't have the full extent of those discussions, and I know that it's in her capable hands. I do have one letter to the Minister of Justice from the John Howard Society, again, a very important organization, long-standing organization in our community that fulfills the very important role of protecting the rights of the accused and the convicted, Mr. Deputy Speaker. They note that they have that there are many helpful changes in the modernization of this Act, but do note, and I'll note this for the record, one concern with Section 19 of the bill, specifically that portion of the bill that restricts the discretion of the coroner to grant standing to organizations like John Howard when it is probing deaths that occur in the correctional context. I'm sure that this is something that the critic will be having additional questions about. I'm not sure if that was just an oversight, Mr. Deputy Speaker, or if there are other reasons for that, but I will leave that in her very capable hands. With that, I'm drawing to the end of my comments on Bill number 189 and will move to adjourn debate.
The member has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 189, the Coroner's Amendment Act 2019. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debate. Item number 14, resume debate on Bill number 194, the Miscellaneous Municipal Statutes Amendment Act 2019.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It is my pleasure to be here today to enter into adjourned debate on Bill number 194, the Miscellaneous Municipal Statutes Amendment Act 2019. This is quite a hearty piece of legislation that exists here, and we're talking about actually 3 different pieces of legislation. And this act proposes to make amendments to the Cities Act, the Municipalities Act, and the Northern Municipalities Act. So that is those are the pieces that are being amended here, Mr. Deputy Speaker. We know that there are significant implications for our municipalities across the province to any changes in this legislation, so it's something we're going to be looking at quite closely. The minister, in her second reading speech, referred to the fact that there have been municipal stakeholder consultations over the last year and a half, and that as a result of those consultations, many changes have been proposed. So they're putting forth the first, which interestingly enough is talking about the protection against reprisal, which we've spent a lot of time in this House talking about as of late when we refer to healthcare workers, Mr. Deputy Speaker. But it's also important that there is protection for municipalities and municipal employees who report wrongdoing. And we know there is a process in place, but if it needs to be strengthened, that's something we should certainly be looking closely into. The second category of amendments that are being proposed are based on administrative effectiveness. And the goal here is to streamline and modernize and replace some of the administrative burden of running a municipality. I think that we certainly live in a bureaucratic world, and if we can create efficiencies, that's great, but we need to make sure that there is still responsibility in accounting, so there needs to be a balance brought in there as well. The third area of amendments is aiming at strengthening and improving local governments, so there's a number of pieces within this section. And then the final area is in response to stakeholder requests for improvements in the legislation. We know that there have been some irregularities in some of the northern municipalities, and that we should certainly be looking as well at ways to amend to address those irregularities as well. And this seems like an opportune time with the opening up of these 3 acts, Mr. Deputy Speaker. So we will be looking at that and as well as talking to folks about what the consultation process looked like and make sure that people have had a chance to engage. But with that, I would move to adjourn debate on this bill for today.
The member from Saskatoon Fairview has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 194. Is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Agreed? Carried.
Adjourn debates. Item number 15, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 195, the Lobbyist Amendment Act 2019. Mr. Belanger.
I recognize the member from Regina Northeast.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Unlike many of the bills that I've entered into debate here this sitting, this one is actually a little bigger deal here on dealing with lobbyists. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, but it doesn't go far enough. This bill reduces the threshold for registration for an in-house lobbyist from 100 hours to 30 hours. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, that's a move in the right direction, but it's not enough. The threshold, Mr. Deputy Speaker, should simply be zero. The moment you start lobbying at this point in time, you should be registering as a lobbyist, and that should be publicly disclosable. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this bill and the act that it amends is all about public disclosure of of influencers, and it's kind of in a related field to the next bill. My friend, the member from Regina Rosemont, will be debating on conflict of interest, and it's all about ethics in government and public disclosure, making sure that there's the dealings of government and members and influencers is subject to public scrutiny, and that those of us here in this assembly and the people in ministers' offices, that they're held accountable for what happens. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, that's important. It's important because we have a government that gives a lease for $1 to one of their biggest donors. It's important because we have a government that saw fit to pay inflated prices for land to donors to their party. It's important because we have a government whose political agenda was to do big infrastructure projects using P3 contracts so that they could avoid public disclosure and scrutiny of who was getting those contracts and what price was being paid by the public. And then you think of last sitting, Mr. Deputy Speaker, where it came to light that a bunch of officials in the under the Minister of Health's purview had accepted big, lavish gifts of vendor-paid travel. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the public needs to have confidence that we are making the best decisions for the people of this province, free from untoward influence. And so, Mr. Deputy Speaker, at this point, the threshold for registering as an in-house lobbyist should be 0 hours. The first minute that you engage in being an in-house lobbyist, you should be in the registration and in the registry. So with that, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm going to move that we adjourn debate on this bill.
The member from Regina Northeast has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 195. It's the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourn debates. Item number 16, resume debate on the second reading motion of Bill number 196, the Members' Conflict of Interest Amendment Act 2019. Mr. Belanger.
I recognize the member from Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to enter into debate briefly here today with respect to Bill number 196, the Members' Conflict of Interest Amendment Act. This is certainly an important act. This is the act that we as members need to comply with, the act that stipulates the types of information that we need to provide to the Conflict of Interest Commissioner, and that's a good thing. That's important to ensure transparency for the public, an understanding of one's financial position, an understanding of controlling assets that one has, beneficial interests that member has, and those are important, of course, because we're engaged in decisions that impact industries and individuals and business across the province. Certainly, the Conflict of Interest Commissioner plays a very important role in being the keeper and the steward of this Act and overseeing this Act in its application to us as MLAs. Certainly, there's some improvements that are brought here in this bill. Clearer definition of gift or personal benefit, Mr. Speaker, and I know personally, there's not much, there's not certainly big value in gifts that are given, but meaningful gifts that are provided, and we detail those each and every year to the Conflict of Interest Commissioner, and some of that gets reported out. I know I've detailed on there things like vegetables and berries that you get from a producer or a farmer's market or something like that, Mr. Speaker, as well as, if you ever were offered a ticket, for example, to a Pats game by a company or something like that, you write those things down as well. Those are important to have accountability and transparency over small items like that, but the clearer definition is helpful, and clearly I don't think it's the small type items like that are in question when talking about motivating the behavior or actions of a member, and so it's important to make sure there's strong powers and teeth for the Conflict of Interest Commissioner and their office to investigate a matter of concern. Some of the other changes, and I think some of this has been brought about already by the Conflict of Interest Commissioner. I'm not sure if it's been enabled further by this Act, but we as members need to detail every last investment that we have, Mr. Speaker, as part of, for example, our RRSP or our savings, Mr. Speaker, and I think that's very reasonable. So that's all for the public record, Mr. Speaker. The public can go online and review what we've chosen, I guess, is individual holdings or investments within our portfolio. That might be a mix of mutual funds through stocks or other investments, but it's recorded there. The one place that there's not, so it's clear if a member holds stock in the Royal Bank or in a certain energy company or in whatever public company, Mr. Speaker, and there's transparency there. There's not a whole lot of transparency for the public when it comes down to numbered companies or holding companies, and I would think that that's an area for significant improvement. I think the Conflict of Interest Commissioner has changed some practice in how they're going to report on this front. I might be wrong on that. I don't want to speak out of turn. I'm not sure if this legislation enables that in a clearer way, but certainly I think that's reasonable that if you own a holding company or a numbered company, that the nature of that of business and sort of a synopsis of what that looks like is provided to the public as well, just the same way as if the member for Northeast owns Scotiabank shares, Mr. Speaker, RBC, he says in his case, which will be also a matter of the public record. The other thing that I'm going to miss the member for Martensville so much, Mr. Speaker. She's a good person. And I'll miss her remarks across the floor. I guess I just weigh in on one other thing. There's changes, of course. The Lobbying Act is important to make sure it has teeth. I know there's been some suggestions about how to strengthen that. Certainly, the role of the Conflict of Interest Commissioner is very important, and making sure that that act is robust and transparent is very important. We'll be constructive on that front. But the whole matter of big money and the perception or the real influence of those big money in politics is an area that goes hand in hand with these areas, and certainly we push for big money to be taken out of politics, Mr. Speaker. We've seen too many examples of large out-of-province corporations putting millions of dollars into, well, for example, the governing party, Mr. Speaker. And then those dollars as well not just flow into the party, but we've also seen the former premier who used to receive a significant amount of money on an annual basis from the party on top of the pay that he received as the Premier of Saskatchewan to fulfill that duty. And certainly it is a matter that begs to question who are you serving on these fronts, and brings about a question of, concerning matters of influence, Mr. Speaker. So certainly we've been very clear as the official opposition that it's time to get big money out of politics to end concerns on this matter. It's, we as members, a premier certainly is paid very adequately to fulfill their service to the people of the province, and there shouldn't be questions as to who they're serving and the choices that they're making in the fulfillment of those duties, Mr. Speaker. With that being said, I will conclude or adjourn debate with respect to Bill number 196, the Members' Conflict of Interest Amendment Act 2019.
The member from Regina Rosemount has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 196. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried. I recognize the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that this House do now adjourn.
Government House Leader has moved that this House adjourns. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried. This House stands adjourned until tomorrow at 10 a.m.